Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. When Rome went quiet, surviving the collapse of civilization. You wake up one morning and the world still looks familiar. The sun rises the same way it always has. The fields outside your village sit quietly, damp with morning fog. But something is wrong, even if you don't yet have the words for it. For generations, your life has been shaped by systems you never questioned. Roads carried traders, messengers, and soldiers. Coins passed from hand to hand. Laws, sometimes harsh, sometimes distant, existed somewhere beyond your village. Now, slowly and unevenly, those systems begin to fail. Not all at once, not with a dramatic collapse, just quietly. This is what the fall of Rome felt like for most people. The Roman Empire did not vanish overnight. In places like Rome, monuments still stood. Aqueducts still arched over valleys, but the people who maintained them were gone or unpaid or dead. When something broke, it stayed broken. For ordinary people, history didn't announce itself with speeches or dates. It arrived as inconvenience, as uncertainty, as the slow realization that help was not coming. By the late 4th and 5th centuries, Roman authority in Western Europe had become thin and unreliable. Soldiers were reassigned, paid late, or not at all. Tax collectors stopped appearing. Governors disappeared behind fortified walls or fled entirely. You might still call yourself Roman, but the empire no longer acted like it remembered you. Money became one of the first casualties. Roman coins had once been everywhere, stamped with emperors' faces and trusted across vast distances. As central mints shut down, coins grew scarce. Trade didn't stop, but it changed. Barter replaced currency. A sack of grain mattered more than stamped silver. If you were a farmer, this shift reshaped your world. Under Rome, you paid taxes in grain or labor, but you also relied on markets. Now those markets shrank or vanished. Roads fell into disrepair. Bridges collapsed and were never rebuilt. Travel became slower, more dangerous, and often pointless. Why risk bandits if there was nothing left to buy? The countryside filled with people retreating inward toward family, toward land, toward survival. Cities suffered the most. Roman cities were not self-sustaining. They depended on long-distance food supply systems that moved grain across seas and rivers. When those systems failed, urban populations collapsed. Some cities shrank to a fraction of their former size. Others were abandoned almost entirely, their stone reused for farm walls and crude shelters. Imagine living in a town that once held tens of thousands, now reduced to a few hundred clustered around a crumbling forum. Public baths stand cold and silent. Sewers clog. Wells dry up. Disease spreads easily in places never designed for scarcity. You don't leave because you're loyal to Rome. You leave because there's no food. For those who stayed behind, daily life became a negotiation with decay. Roof tiles fell and were replaced with thatch. Marble statues were toppled and burned for lime. Even literacy faded, not because people suddenly became ignorant, but because schools required teachers, teachers required pay, and pay required stability. Most people never learned to read. Now even fewer did. Law changed too. Roman law had been written, procedural, slow. In its place rose something older and more personal. Justice became local. Disputes were settled by elders, warbands, or force. Compensation mattered more than guilt. Violence became a language everyone understood. This wasn't chaos, it was adaptation. Into this vacuum stepped new powers. Local strongmen, former soldiers, landowners with armed followers. They offered protection in exchange for loyalty, labor, or food. Over time, these arrangements hardened into something familiar, early feudalism. You worked the land. They defended it. Whether that defense actually came when needed was another matter. Meanwhile, waves of migration and invasion reshaped the map. Groups like the Visigoths, Vandals, and Franks didn't see themselves as destroyers. They were looking for land, security, and legitimacy. Many tried to preserve Roman customs even as Roman administration vanished. One of the great ironies of the so-called Dark Ages is that people desperately tried to keep Rome alive without the tools to do so. Consider the reign of Charlemagne centuries later. He styled himself as a Roman emperor, revived titles, promoted learning, and standardized laws. But even he ruled a world that no longer knew how to repair Roman roads or read many Roman texts. The knowledge wasn't lost in a fire. It leaked away generation by generation. For ordinary families, survival meant narrowing horizons. You married close to home. You died close to home. The world beyond your valley might as well have been another planet. Stories replaced maps. Rumors replaced news. And always there was hunger. Harvest failures hit harder now. Without empire-wide reserves, one bad year could be fatal. People stretched grain with acorns, bark, and weeds. Livestock became walking savings accounts slaughtered only in desperation. Children learned early what scarcity felt like. Death was common but not dramatic. People died of infections from small cuts, from childbirth, from winters that lasted too long. Graves were shallow, memory was short. Yet life continued. You planted because spring came anyway. You repaired what you could. You prayed not always to the same God, not always the same way, but you prayed because uncertainty demanded meaning. This is the part school often skips. The fall of Rome was not the end of civilization. It was the loss of infrastructure. And for the people living through it, that loss felt endless. They did not know they were entering a dark age. They believed the world had simply become smaller, colder, and more fragile, and that this was how it would always be. As generations passed with no improvement, no return of roads or order or distant authority, one question lingered quietly beneath everyday survival. Was this decline temporary, or had the world already reached its best days? By the time you are old enough to remember the world clearly, Rome is already a memory rather than a presence. Not a storybook memory, no golden age, no marble perfection, but a half-understood idea that older people talk about in lowered voices. They remember officials who once came on schedule, soldiers who marched in formation, grain ships that arrived when expected. To you, these stories sound exaggerated, almost mythical, like tales of giants or heroes. Your reality is simpler and harsher. You live among ruins you did not build and cannot repair. All across Western Europe, Roman structures lingered long after Roman authority vanished. Stone walls still marked old cities. Cracked roads still pointed toward places no one visited anymore. In some regions, people lived inside former amphitheaters, patching arches with wood and mud, turning grand public spaces into crowded shelters for families and livestock. These ruins shaped daily life in strange ways. They provided ready-made stone, shelter, and sometimes protection, but they also reminded people of a world they could no longer recreate. A broken aqueduct wasn't just useless infrastructure. It was proof that something essential had been lost. You learned early not to rely on things beyond your control. Water came from wells or streams now, not pipes. Waste was dumped far from homes when possible. When not, sickness followed. Dysentery, fevers, skin infections, illness was part of the rhythm of life, like seasons or hunger. Medical knowledge existed, but it traveled poorly. Roman texts still survived in fragments, often misunderstood or half-copied. Herbal remedies were common, sometimes effective, sometimes deadly. Bloodletting and prayer were equally trusted. Survival depended more on luck and constitution than treatment. Work filled most waking hours. If you were a peasant and most people were, your life revolved around land that might not even legally belong to you. Ownership was blurry. Authority was personal. A local lord claimed protection rights. A monastery claimed old Roman estates. Boundaries shifted with marriages, violence, and inheritance. You worked because not working meant starving. Agriculture itself had changed. Without centralized planning or surplus redistribution, farming became conservative. People favored crops that were hardy rather than productive. Yields dropped. Fields were smaller. Tools were repaired endlessly instead of replaced. Iron was precious. Oxen mattered more than gold. Seasonal rhythms governed everything. Spring planting, summer maintenance, autumn harvest, winter endurance. A failed harvest haunted families for years, not just months. Grain seed eaten in desperation meant future famine. Children were labor from an early age. By 7 or 8, they herded animals, gathered firewood, or helped in fields. Education, when it existed at all, was usually tied to the church. Even then, it was limited to basic prayers and memorization. Literacy was rare, but memory was strong. People remembered obligations, insults, family lines, and feuds with astonishing clarity. In a world without reliable records, forgetting could be dangerous. Violence was never far away. Without imperial courts, disputes easily escalated. A stolen animal could lead to bloodshed. Revenge was expected. Compensation payments, known in some regions as wurgeld, placed monetary value on human life, scaled by gender and status. Justice was pragmatic, not moral. If you were poor, your life was cheaper. Protection mattered more than fairness. This is why people accepted unequal arrangements. You pledged loyalty to someone stronger because isolation was deadly. Over time, this hardened into dependency. Land in exchange for service. Safety in exchange for obedience. Freedom became abstract. Religion filled some of the emptiness left by Rome's retreat. Christianity spread unevenly, absorbing local customs and fears. Saints replaced household gods. Relics replaced legal guarantees. The church offered continuity when governments could not, but it also reflected the instability around it. Monasteries became islands of order. Behind their walls, monks copied texts by hand, slowly preserving fragments of classical knowledge. But even these centers were vulnerable to raids, famine, internal collapse. In the Eastern Roman Empire, things looked different. Cities still functioned. Bureaucracy still existed. Taxes were still collected. From places like Constantinople, emperors governed a state that still called itself Roman. But for you in the West, that world might as well have been a rumor. Occasionally, traders arrived with strange coins or silk scraps. They spoke of laws, schools, and standing armies. These stories felt unreal, like news from another lifetime. You had no reason to believe such stability would ever return to your valley. Even time felt different now. Without standardized calendars or official announcements, dates blurred. Years were remembered by events. The winter everyone nearly starved, the summer the river flooded, the year the Lord's son died in a feud. History became personal and local. Death was constant but quiet. Cemeteries expanded slowly. Most people died at home, surrounded by family who had already seen too much death to dramatize it. Grief existed, but survival demanded restraint. Yet there was resilience here too. People adapted with remarkable flexibility. They reused materials endlessly. They learned which wild plants were edible. They formed tight kin networks. They sang while working not for joy, but to mark time, to keep pace, to endure monotony. This was not a world of heroic collapse. It was a world of long adjustment. What made it brutal was not the violence alone, but the absence of expectation. No one promised improvement. No authority offered long-term plans. You lived knowing your children might inherit less than you did, and their children even less. And still you planted. Because even in ruins, life continued. Not optimistically, not confidently, but stubbornly. As centuries passed, people stopped waiting for Rome to return. They built new identities from fragments, new kingdoms, new customs, new loyalties. The empire faded not because it was defeated, but because it became irrelevant to daily survival. Which raises an uncomfortable question, one the people of the early Middle Ages never asked aloud but lived with every day. If civilization could quietly disappear once, how permanent was anything they were building now? By the time you reach the end of your life, Rome is no longer something you remember. It is something you inherited second-hand stories told by grandparents who heard them from their own elders. The empire has slipped fully into the past, not as a fallen giant, but as a half-remembered standard against which nothing else quite measures up. And yet life has not stopped. What replaced Rome was not emptiness. It was something slower, rougher, and more intimate. Power no longer flowed outward from a distant capital. It gathered locally. Authority belonged to those who could protect land, food, and people sometimes well, often badly. Kings ruled smaller territories. Lords controlled clusters of villages. Loyalty was personal, sworn face to face, because abstract institutions had failed before. This new order felt permanent to the people living inside it. Castles began as practical structures, wooden fortifications on hills, built quickly and repaired often. They were not symbols of grandeur but of fear. Fear of raids, fear of neighbors, fear of the next winter. Stone castles would come later, but even they were more about survival than dominance. Warfare became routine, not constant but expected. Small-scale conflicts over land, inheritance, and honor shaped borders that shifted every generation. There were no standing armies for most of this period. Fighting was seasonal, temporary, and deeply personal. You fought because you had to, not because you believed in conquest. Trade slowly returned, but on a reduced scale. Local markets reappeared first, weekly gatherings where surplus grain, wool, or pottery changed hands. Long-distance trade remained rare and risky, dependent on fragile networks and relative peace. When foreign goods appeared, salt, wine, metalwork, they carried enormous value, not just economically but psychologically. They hinted at a wider world that still existed beyond the horizon. The church grew alongside this fragmented political landscape. It offered something rare: continuity across generations. Bishops outlasted kings. Monasteries endured while villages vanished. Religious calendars provided rhythm where civic ones had disappeared. Faith was practical. People prayed for rain, for health, for survival. Theology mattered less than results. Saints were chosen because they seemed effective. Pilgrimages happened because hope demanded movement. Even so, belief did not erase fear. Hell felt closer than heaven. God was powerful but unpredictable. Suffering was often interpreted as normal, even deserved. Education remained limited but not extinct. In quiet rooms, monks continued copying texts slowly, carefully, often without fully understanding what they preserved. Errors crept in. Meanings shifted. Knowledge survived in altered forms. This preservation mattered more than anyone realized at the time. In the East, the Roman idea never truly died. The empire centered around Constantinople continued to function, legislate, and fight wars under emperors like Justinian I, who dreamed of restoring Roman glory. His efforts briefly reunited parts of the old empire, but at enormous cost in lives, taxes, and stability. For people in the West, these reconquests were distant echoes. They did not bring back roads or baths or civic order. The divide between the Roman past and the medieval present remained. What did grow stronger was identity. People began to see themselves not as Romans, but as Franks, Saxons, Lombards, villagers of a particular valley, followers of a particular lord. The scale of belonging shrank, and with it, expectations. No one waited for an empire anymore. By the end of the early Middle Ages, something new had solidified. It was not better than Rome, and it was not worse in every way. It was different, more fragile, more local, less ambitious. Life expectancy remained low. Famine and disease still loomed. Violence was normalized, but there was also adaptation, continuity, and slow improvement. Fields expanded again, villages stabilized, trade routes reopened cautiously, knowledge accumulated piece by piece. The world did not recover quickly, but it did not remain frozen. Looking back, historians once labeled this period the Dark Ages, imagining a time of ignorance and decline. That label says more about later expectations than lived reality. For the people who survived it, this was not darkness, it was endurance. They lived without safety nets, without guarantees, without the assumption that tomorrow would improve. They built systems that assumed instability as normal. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for the medieval world that followed and, eventually, the modern one. The brutality of the Dark Ages was not in constant catastrophe, but in prolonged uncertainty. In knowing that civilization could fail quietly, that progress was reversible, that comfort was temporary. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson it leaves behind. Because if an empire as vast and confident as Rome could fade into memory without a single definitive ending, replaced not by chaos, but by a long, grinding adjustment, then the question it poses to the modern world is uncomfortably simple. How much of what surrounds you today feels permanent, only because you haven't watched it disappear yet? You learn quickly that shouting is useless. If someone steals from you, hurts you, or kills a member of your family, there is no distant authority to appeal to, no courthouse miles away, no officials arriving with written orders. Whatever justice exists will happen close to home, face to face, and often with blood attached to it. This is life after Roman law fades from daily existence. Under the empire, law had been impersonal and procedural. It was slow, expensive, and often unfair, but it existed. You could, in theory, appeal a decision. You could point to written codes. You could expect punishment to follow certain rules. In the early medieval world, that structure collapses. Law becomes local, justice becomes social, and vengeance becomes a form of order. If you live in a village, everyone knows everyone else's business. Reputation matters more than innocence. Strength matters more than evidence. Wrongdoing is not measured by abstract guilt, but by damage done and by who has the power to respond. When harm occurs, the first question is not what law was broken, but who was offended. Family replaces the state. If your brother is killed, his death is not only a loss, it is an obligation. You are expected to respond. Doing nothing invites future attacks. It marks your family as weak. Silence is dangerous. This is how feuds begin. Feuds are not mindless violence. They are structured, remembered, and inherited. A single act, an insult, a stolen animal, a killing can echo across generations. Children grow up knowing exactly who their enemies are and why. These conflicts rarely end cleanly. They pause. They settle temporarily through payments or marriages. Then they resume when circumstances change. To manage this cycle, early medieval societies developed systems of compensation. In many regions, a person's life has a price. This price varies by gender, status, and social value. Killing a noble costs more than killing a peasant. Killing a woman may cost less or more depending on her reproductive or political importance. This system is brutal but practical. Paying compensation allows violence to stop without wiping out entire families. It is not justice as fairness. It is justice as damage control. If compensation is refused or unpaid, blood follows. Assemblies often held outdoors try to regulate this process. Elders speak. Oaths are sworn. Witnesses matter, but so does prestige. Someone with allies speaks louder than someone without them. Truth is flexible. Punishment is public. Humiliation is a tool. Exile, mutilation, and execution exist, but they are risky. Killing someone can trigger retaliation. Sometimes it is safer to blind or maim, leaving the offender alive but powerless. Fear shapes every decision. This environment rewards strength and loyalty. People attach themselves to powerful figures, lords, war leaders, kings, not because they believe in their moral authority, but because protection is survival. The stronger your protector, the safer you are. But protection is not guaranteed. Lords fight each other, alliances shift, promises break. When conflict erupts, villages suffer first, crops are burned, livestock stolen, people killed not for who they are but for where they live. Neutrality is nearly impossible. In places like Anglo-Saxon England, written law codes begin to reappear not as universal principles, but as attempts to stabilize fragile power. Kings issue rules defining compensation, theft, and violence. These laws are less about morality than control. By setting prices on injury and death, rulers insert themselves into disputes. Justice becomes a source of revenue and authority. Slowly, vengeance is redirected, not eliminated, but managed. Still, enforcement is inconsistent. A law written in a king's name means little if the king cannot enforce it. Most justice remains local, negotiated, and deeply personal. Religion influences this world, but it does not tame it. Christian teachings discourage revenge, but priests live among the same people shaped by fear and obligation. Forgiveness is praised but rarely practiced when survival is at stake. Oaths sworn on relics or scriptures carry weight. Breaking them risks not just social punishment, but divine wrath. Fear of God becomes another tool in regulating behavior. Even so, violence persists. You grow up knowing how easily order collapses. You learn when to speak and when to stay silent. You measure risk constantly: who is watching, who might take offense, who might intervene. Justice is not something you expect. It is something you navigate. And in this world, the most dangerous moment is not when violence happens, but when it almost happens. When an insult hangs in the air. When a theft is suspected but unproven. When everyone knows something must be done, but no one knows what will stop it from spiraling. Because once blood is spilled, the question is never whether there will be consequences. It is how many people will be pulled into them, and how long the memory of that violence will last. So you are left with an uneasy realization, one that defines life without law. If order depends entirely on people remembering past wrongs, then peace is always temporary, and justice is never finished. If you want to survive in a world without dependable law, you learn to remember everything. Not dates or documents, those barely exist, but slights, favors, debts, and names. Memory becomes your legal system. Who wronged your family? Who helped you when help was dangerous? Who stayed silent when silence caused harm? Nothing disappears, it only waits. Feuds thrive in this environment because they offer something predictable. They explain violence. They give it structure. In a strange way, they make suffering understandable. If your cousin is killed, it is not random. It is part of a story that began before you were born. That story gives meaning to loss, even if it guarantees more of it. Most feuds do not begin with murder. They begin with insult, a disputed boundary stone, a stolen animal, a marriage promise broken. These moments are small, but they carry weight because they signal disrespect. And disrespect in a fragile society is a threat. If you allow one insult to pass unanswered, others follow. So response is expected, not always violent at first. Sometimes it is verbal, sometimes economic, sometimes symbolic, but escalation is built into the system. Each response invites a counter-response. Over time, the original cause becomes irrelevant. What matters is balance. This is why feuds are remembered longer than treaties. A treaty relies on trust. A feud relies on obligation. Children grow up inside these obligations. They are taught who their enemies are before they understand why. Songs, stories, and warnings reinforce the memory. Don't walk near that stream. Don't trade with that family. Don't marry into them. The past becomes a map of danger. Communities attempt to contain this instability through ritualized conflict resolution. Meetings are held in open spaces, fields, crossroads, hills where everyone can witness the process. Witnesses matter because they carry memory forward. What is decided publicly is harder to deny later. In some regions, assemblies develop into formal institutions. One of the most famous examples is the Thing, where disputes are argued, compensation negotiated, and verdicts pronounced. These gatherings are not peaceful by default, but they create a shared framework for conflict. Still, enforcement depends on willingness. There is no police force to compel obedience. If a powerful family refuses a verdict, the system breaks. And often it does. This fragility explains why people value kinship so intensely. Blood ties are insurance. The larger your family network, the more leverage you have. Marriage becomes political. Women are often traded between families to seal peace, not because anyone believes it will last forever, but because it might delay violence. Delay is victory. Exile is another common solution. Removing one person from a community can diffuse tension temporarily, but exile is dangerous. An exiled person has nothing to lose. They often return with allies or strike from outside accepted norms. Outlaws become legends not because they are admired, but because they embody what happens when social rules fail entirely. Religion offers another layer of control. Oaths sworn before God are harder to break. Churches and monasteries sometimes provide sanctuary, temporary protection that pauses vengeance. Killing someone in a sacred space risks divine punishment, which many fear more than human retaliation. But sanctuary does not erase grievances. It only postpones them. Kings and rulers slowly realize that uncontrolled feuding weakens their power. Dead farmers do not pay taxes. Burned villages cannot supply soldiers. Endless revenge destabilizes territories. So rulers intervene not out of compassion, but necessity. They impose fines. They claim authority over serious crimes. They redefine violence against certain people, clergy, royal officials, messengers as crimes against the ruler himself. This shifts revenge away from families and towards centralized power. One of the clearest examples of this transition appears under rulers like Alfred the Great, who promoted law codes blending Christian ethics with older compensation systems. His laws still accepted vengeance, but tried to narrow when and how it could occur. Justice becomes something negotiated between custom and control. Even so, these systems remain uneven. Laws exist on parchment, but power exists in people. If a ruler is weak, laws are ignored. If a ruler is strong, peace may follow, but only as long as strength lasts. Ordinary people understand this instinctively. They do not expect fairness. They expect survival. You choose your words carefully. You watch how disputes unfold. You decide when to involve elders, when to offer compensation, when to prepare for violence. These decisions shape not just your life, but your children's future. This constant tension wears people down. Living inside a feud means constant vigilance. Travel is dangerous. Markets are risky. Even festivals can turn violent if enemies meet unexpectedly. Everyone knows stories of celebrations ending in bloodshed. So communities develop unspoken rules. Who sits where? Who speaks first? Who pours the drink? These details matter because they signal respect or insult. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the careful management of it. And yet, despite all this effort, feuds still spiral out of control. A death that demands response. A response that demands more. Entire families wiped out not because they wanted war, but because they could not escape it. When historians later look back, they often see this as senseless brutality. But for the people living inside it, feuds are rational responses to a world without reliable authority. If no one will protect you, you must protect yourself. If no one will remember your suffering, you must make it unforgettable. This logic sustains violence even as it destroys communities. It explains why peace is fragile and why law, when it finally returns in stronger forms, is welcomed even when it is harsh. Because any law is better than endless memory. As new kingdoms consolidate power in the later Middle Ages, feuds do not disappear, but they lose legitimacy. Revenge becomes criminal. Violence becomes the ruler's business. Justice slowly shifts from personal obligation to institutional control. But that shift takes centuries. For a long time, people live in the in-between world where law exists in theory, vengeance in practice, and survival depends on knowing exactly when one gives way to the other. Which leaves one lingering question, felt by everyone but answered by no one. When justice depends on memory and power rather than truth, how do you ever know when a wrong has truly been paid for? The change does not arrive suddenly. It never does. There is no moment when you wake up and realize that vengeance is no longer your responsibility. No proclamation read aloud in every village. No universal agreement that the old ways have ended. Instead, something subtler happens. One day, when violence breaks out as it always has, someone else intervenes. At first, it is tentative. A king's representative demands compensation not for the family of the dead, but for the crown. A fine is imposed, payable to someone who was not directly harmed. This feels strange, unnatural, almost offensive. Why should a ruler profit from your grief? But the message is clear. This violence is no longer only yours. This is how centralized justice begins, not by eliminating brutality, but by redirecting it. As kingdoms slowly consolidate power, rulers realize that monopolizing violence is essential to ruling. Feuds weaken authority. Private revenge creates competing loyalties. If families can kill freely, kings are just another faction. So kings insert themselves into the cycle. They redefine certain acts as crimes against peace rather than individuals. Murder is no longer just a personal loss, it is a disruption of order. Theft is no longer settled only between neighbors, it offends the ruler who claims guardianship over the land. Punishment becomes symbolic. Executions are staged publicly, not to satisfy families, but to demonstrate power. Justice is no longer about restoring balance between kin groups. It is about showing who controls force. This shift is uneven and fragile. In remote areas, feuds continue as they always have. In towns and regions closer to royal authority, vengeance becomes risky. Killing an enemy might bring not closure but the gallows. Fear changes sides. Written law returns not as Roman universalism but as royal command. Laws are copied, proclaimed, revised. They are still harsh, still unequal, but they create something new: predictability. Predictability is revolutionary. People begin to adjust their behavior. Disputes are brought to courts not because they are fair but because they are safer. Compensation is standardized. Violence becomes regulated. Justice is no longer negotiated entirely in open fields. It moves indoors into halls, churches, and eventually courtrooms. One of the clearest turning points in England comes after the Norman conquest under William the Conqueror. His rule does not eliminate brutality, far from it, but it enforces order through overwhelming authority. Feuds still exist, but they are overshadowed by something stronger: the king's peace. Breaking that peace becomes the ultimate crime. Sheriffs, judges, and officials spread across the land. Local customs survive, but they are increasingly filtered through royal oversight. Justice becomes something done to people, not negotiated by them. This is not universally welcomed. For families accustomed to handling their own affairs, this new system feels alien and unjust. Why should a distant ruler decide punishment? Why should grief be answered with fines and procedure instead of revenge? But over time, exhaustion sets in. Endless feuds drain communities. They kill laborers. They destroy crops. They turn minor disputes into generational tragedies. The promise of stability, even enforced stability, becomes appealing. People begin to accept restraint. Violence does not disappear. It is simply reframed. Wars are declared by rulers rather than families. Punishment becomes theatrical rather than personal. Authority replaces memory as the foundation of justice. This transformation reshapes society deeply. Families loosen their grip on vengeance. Kinship remains important, but it is no longer the sole source of protection. Individuals become subjects rather than clan members. Loyalty shifts upward toward kings and institutions. Law becomes something external. And with that shift comes a new kind of brutality. Prisons, executions, corporal punishment, these are not gentle alternatives. Centralized justice can be merciless, but it is consistent. Consistency changes how people think. Children grow up learning laws instead of enemies. Disputes are framed in terms of rights rather than honor. Insults still sting, but they are less likely to start wars. Peace becomes imaginable, not permanent, but possible. Looking back, it is tempting to see this transition as progress, and in many ways it is. Feuds fade. Casual violence declines. Ordinary people gain some protection from the whims of powerful families. But something is lost too. The old system, brutal as it was, made responsibility personal. Harm demanded response. Memory mattered. In the new system, justice can feel abstract, detached, and indifferent to suffering. Grief becomes a legal matter. This tension never fully resolves. Even in modern societies, echoes remain. We still argue about punishment versus reconciliation, about who owns justice, about whether the state truly represents the people it claims to protect. The early medieval world lived this question every day, without theory or distance. They learned slowly, painfully, that a world without law is unbearable, but that law itself can become another kind of violence. And so the legacy of feuds is not just brutality. It is the reason people eventually accepted authority over revenge, why they allowed rulers to take control of justice, why the modern state exists at all. Because when no one comes to help, you learn to help yourself. But when helping yourself destroys everything around you, you begin to wonder whether surrendering some power, even to imperfect systems, is the only way to survive together. That question, born in blood and memory, still follows history forward. Story 3. Famine years: what people actually ate when the crops failed. You know a bad year is coming long before anyone says the word famine. It starts quietly. The spring rains come late or not at all. Seeds sit in dry soil too long. Shoots emerge thin and uneven. By early summer, you can already tell the harvest will be small, but hope lingers, because hope is cheaper than preparation. Everyone watches the sky. In the early medieval world, nearly all food comes from local land. There are no national reserves, no emergency imports arriving from far away. What grows nearby is what you eat. What fails nearby is what kills you. Bread is life, not as a metaphor, as a calculation. Grain provides most calories. Wheat where possible, rye or barley where soil is poor, oats where nothing else will grow. When grain fails, everything else becomes a substitute, a supplement, or a last resort. The first response to shortage is rationing. Households stretch stores carefully. Grain is ground more finely. Bread loaves become smaller and darker. Meals thin out. Hunger arrives not as sudden starvation, but as constant restraint. You feel it in your body, first as weakness, then as irritability, then as exhaustion. By late summer, it's clear the harvest won't recover. Ears of grain are short. Some fields aren't worth cutting. Seed grain meant for next year is eaten now, even though everyone knows what that means for the future. This decision haunts families for years. Markets react quickly. Prices rise beyond reach. Those with surplus hoard it. Those without sell what little they own. Tools, clothing, livestock, everything becomes exchangeable for food. Oxen are slaughtered early, even though losing them cripples future farming. Desperation reshapes logic. When bread truly disappears, diets change in ways school textbooks rarely describe. People turn to foods usually ignored. Acorns are collected, soaked to remove bitterness, then ground into flour. Tree bark, especially from elm or pine, is stripped, dried, and mixed into dough. It provides bulk, not nutrition. Wild plants become essential. Nettles, sorrel, dandelion greens, plantain. Knowledge of edible weeds suddenly matters more than skill with a plow. Elders who remember past famines become guides. Mistakes are deadly. Mushrooms kill as often as they feed. Roots resemble edible ones until they don't. Hunger lowers caution. Poisoning increases during famine years, quietly adding to the death toll. Meat becomes rare. Hunting increases, but so does competition. Forests are claimed by lords. Poaching is punished harshly even during famine. People take the risk anyway. Small animals disappear first. Birds, rabbits, hedgehogs, then dogs, then horses if desperation deepens. Archaeological evidence from across early medieval Europe shows butcher marks on animals never meant for food. This is not decadence, it is survival. Milk dries up as animals weaken. Cheese becomes impossible to make. Eggs vanish when hens are eaten. Even beer, often safer than water, becomes scarce when grain runs out. Water alone cannot sustain you. Children suffer first. Their bodies have no reserves. Infant mortality spikes sharply during famine years. Those who survive are often stunted for life, their bones carrying evidence of hunger long after conditions improve. Illness follows famine closely. Malnutrition weakens immune systems. Diseases that would normally be survivable become fatal. Dysentery spreads when people drink unsafe water in desperation. Crowded households share everything, including sickness. Burials increase quietly. There are no mass graves, yet just more funerals, fewer words. People migrate when they can. Entire families abandon land they have worked for generations. Hopping conditions are better elsewhere. Often they aren't. Roads fill with beggars. Towns shut their gates. Charity exists, but it is limited. Monasteries distribute food when possible, but their stores are finite. Once emptied, even holy places face hunger. In regions once tied to Roman infrastructure, abandoned granaries and storehouses are sometimes reopened only to reveal they are long empty. The empire's shadow offers no help now. In places like Frankish kingdoms, famines recur every decade or two. They are expected, not exceptional. Chroniclers mention them briefly as background conditions rather than disasters. To this year was added great hunger, one text notes, then moves on. That casual tone hides enormous suffering. Parents make impossible choices. Who eats today? Who waits? Who is strong enough to survive hunger a little longer? Infanticide increases quietly, rarely recorded, never discussed openly. Old people starve themselves so children might live. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Cannibalism appears in extreme cases. It is rare, but documented. Chroniclers mention it with horror and brevity as something almost unspeakable. These accounts are not myths, they are last resorts in years when nothing else remains. Social order frays under these pressures. Theft increases. Violence follows. Lords tighten control over remaining resources. Punishments become harsher to deter unrest. Faith is tested. People pray harder. They also question more deeply. Why does God send hunger? Why do some survive while others do? Clergy offer explanations, but none provide relief. When famine finally breaks through a good harvest, better weather, or simple exhaustion, the world does not return to normal. Fields lie abandoned, tools are gone, people are missing. Recovery takes years. Those who survive remember everything. The taste of bark bread, the ache that never left their stomach, the sound of livestock being slaughtered too early. Hunger becomes a memory carried forward, shaping behavior long after food returns. This is why medieval people hoard, why they distrust abundance, why they fear waste. Plenty feels temporary because it always has been. And this is only the beginning. Because when famine stretches across multiple years or strikes entire regions at once, the strategies of survival grow darker, the social fabric weaker, and the line between endurance and collapse dangerously thin. Which leads to a quiet, unsettling question that famine leaves behind every time it passes. If hunger can strip society down to desperation so quickly, how fragile was everyday life to begin with? Once the stored grain is gone, hunger changes character. At first, it is a private struggle, families stretching meals, pretending not to notice the smaller portions. But when famine deepens, hunger becomes public. You see it in the fields, the forests, the roads. The entire landscape is slowly consumed, stripped of anything that might be turned into food. This is the stage where survival depends less on farming and more on memory. People begin to eat what they normally walk past without noticing. Leaves, roots, seeds, insects. The countryside becomes a pantry, but only for those who know how to use it. Knowledge that once seemed trivial suddenly decides who lives. Elders remember which plants kept people alive the last time this happened. Tree products become critical. Acorns are among the most important famine foods, especially in oak-heavy regions. They are bitter and hard to digest, but with careful soaking and grinding, they can be made edible. Entire families spend days leaching tannins out of acorn meal, knowing that skipping this step can make them violently ill. Even then, acorn bread is dense and unpleasant. It fills the stomach without nourishing it. People eat it anyway. Bark bread appears next. Inner bark, particularly from elm, pine, and birch, is scraped, dried, and ground. It adds bulk to dough when there is no grain left. Archaeological evidence from early medieval famine layers shows bread containing wood fibers, grass seeds, and crushed straw. This is not creative cooking, it is arithmetic. Wild grasses are harvested for their seeds, even though the yield is painfully small. Women and children spend hours gathering what would normally be ignored. Berries are eaten green before they ripen. Roots are dug up early, weakening future growth. Forests empty quickly. Hunting pressure intensifies and animals disappear in a predictable order. First the easiest prey, birds, eggs, rabbits, then harder targets like deer. Finally, animals that are dangerous or taboo. Dogs vanish from villages, not all at once but quietly. They are slaughtered and eaten without ceremony. Horses follow in extreme cases, even though losing them damages transport and farming for years. This is how famine steals the future to pay for the present. Fishing becomes vital where possible. Rivers and coasts offer some relief, but overfishing quickly reduces stocks. Weirs and traps multiply. Disputes over fishing rights increase. Hunger turns shared resources into battlegrounds. Salt becomes precious not for flavor but for preservation. Without salt, meat spoils quickly. Those with access to salt springs or trade routes gain enormous power. Others dry or smoke food desperately, losing much of it to rot. As diets collapse, bodies change. People lose muscle first, then fat, then resilience. Minor injuries fester, teeth loosen, hair thins, skin cracks. Hunger shows itself in ways that cannot be hidden. Children's growth slows or stops. Survivors of famine years often carry permanent signs: short stature, weakened bones, joint problems. These are not temporary hardships. They are lifelong imprints. Social behavior shifts too. Hospitality disappears. In better times, feeding a guest is expected. During famine, a stranger is a threat. Doors close. Villages turn inward. Beggars are driven away not from cruelty, but fear. Charity becomes selective. Help is given to kin first, then neighbors, then no one. Monasteries still distribute food when possible, but even they must choose who receives it. Moral ideals bend under biological pressure. Crime increases, but so does punishment. Stealing food becomes common and dangerous. Lords enforce harsh penalties to protect their stores. Executions for theft appear in records during severe famines. Order is maintained by terror, not mercy. Faith does not disappear, but it changes tone. Prayer becomes desperate, repetitive. Processions multiply. Fasting, normally voluntary, loses meaning when everyone is starving already. Some interpret famine as punishment. Others see it as a test. A few quietly stop believing altogether. In regions once integrated into Roman systems, people sometimes attempt to revive old infrastructure. Abandoned granaries are cleared. Fields are replanted near ruined roads. These efforts rarely succeed immediately, but they show a refusal to fully surrender. Famine also reshapes migration. People leave dying land behind, walking toward rumors of abundance. Many die on the road. Others are turned away from towns protecting their own supplies. Entire communities fragment, their histories ending not with violence but with dispersal. Chroniclers record these movements vaguely. Many wandered. The poor suffered greatly. The scale is enormous, but the language remains restrained. In places like early medieval Ireland, famine becomes woven into cultural memory, preserved in law codes, poems, and proverbs. Advice about storing food, protecting seed grain, and limiting waste is passed down with urgency. Hunger teaches harsh lessons quickly. When famine finally loosens its grip, often unevenly, patch by patch, survivors do not celebrate immediately. They wait. They distrust improvement. Fields are planted cautiously. Grain is hidden away. Recovery is slow and fragile. Those who lived through severe famine never forget how close everything came to collapse. Their choices afterward are shaped by scarcity. They value stability over ambition. They fear risk. They resist change that might threaten food security. This conservatism defines much of early medieval society. It is not ignorance, it is memory. And yet, even with all this adaptation, some famines go too far. When hunger lasts multiple years, when weather patterns shift, when disease joins starvation, survival strategies begin to fail entirely. People run out of things to eat, which leads to the most disturbing stage of all, one rarely discussed, briefly mentioned, and quickly judged by later generations. Because when the landscape itself has been consumed, the question is no longer what people are willing to eat, but what they are willing to become in order to survive. When famine stretches beyond a single season, survival begins to reshape everything you thought you knew about life. Hunger stops being a temporary inconvenience. It becomes the lens through which every decision is made. Every act of daily life, planting, gathering, even speaking, is influenced by how little food exists and how precarious tomorrow feels. You learn the arithmetic of survival quickly. A loaf of acorn bread lasts longer if rationed to half a family. A rabbit, skinned and roasted, feeds only part of a household. Every meal is a negotiation with scarcity. Families adapt creatively, sometimes horrifically. You make soups from grasses and roots. You dry leaves, crush seeds, mix bark into dough. You gather insects, small amphibians, and birds previously considered pests. Survival trumps taste, comfort, and sometimes morality. Children are most vulnerable. Their small bodies require constant nourishment. Many die quietly in beds or by the roadside without record. Survivors carry the memory of hunger into adulthood stunted, weakened, but hardened. Communities fragment. Those with connections, friends, kin, or sympathetic lords find a measure of security. Those without die quietly or are forced to migrate. Roads become conduits for wandering families, desperate travelers, and the occasional band of raiders. In extreme cases, cannibalism occurs. Chroniclers report such acts with horror, but archaeologists have found evidence that it was not just rumor. People resorted to eating the dead to survive. Such choices are remembered not as heroism, but as proof of the extremity of hunger. Civilization persists, but barely. Hunger reshapes social norms. Hospitality, a sacred duty, is often abandoned. Strangers are viewed as threats to survival. Communities hoard what they have. The very act of sharing becomes an ethical dilemma. To feed one outsider may mean starving your children. Religion, too, adapts. Prayer becomes ritualized desperation. Pilgrimages increase, not always to visit holy sites, but to find food and protection. Monasteries distribute charity, but even their stores are finite. Saints become symbols of hope and instruments of control. The church's authority is reinforced when it can provide grain, even in small amounts. When the famine ends because of a better harvest, imported supplies, or simply because the weakened population cannot survive further, it does not feel like victory. Fields lie fallow, livestock numbers remain low, and grain stores are empty. People survive, but they do so with caution, suspicion, and the bitter memory of what hunger can do. This is the reality of life during repeated shortages. You begin to understand that survival is not merely about bravery or skill, but about anticipation, patience, and flexibility. You plan not for prosperity, but to prevent collapse. The memory of famine shapes every future choice, from what to plant to whom to trust. Historical records hint at the consequences of these cycles. Chroniclers note years of great hunger across Frankish kingdoms, early medieval Ireland, and Anglo-Saxon England. They report deaths, migrations, and social unrest, but often gloss over the full human cost. Archaeology fills in the gaps: bones showing malnutrition, remains of bark and acorn bread, evidence of sudden mortality spikes. These clues reveal a pattern. Famine shaped societies as much as war, law, or politics. In a practical sense, famine also reshaped economies and social structures. Those who survived controlled land and seed more strictly. They hoarded livestock and grain. They implemented new rules about sharing and labor. In many regions, what began as survival strategies hardened into social norms. Conservatism in planting, cautious trade, and tight kinship networks became features of medieval life precisely because famine forced them to be. Famine also forced moral compromises. Survival often required breaking laws or taboos, stealing from neighbors, eating animals previously considered sacred, even abandoning or sacrificing children. These choices are rarely recorded in detail but would have been experienced by almost everyone. Historical memory remembers famine with terms like trial or suffering, but the lived experience was brutal, intimate, and morally ambiguous. The lingering effect of famine is psychological. Generations grow up under the shadow of hunger. Memories are passed down through stories, warnings, and practices. Store extra grain, preserve seed, avoid waste, trust carefully, rely on kin. These habits, rooted in necessity, outlive the crisis and shape societies for decades, even centuries. This cyclical tension between scarcity and survival teaches a profound lesson. Civilization is far more fragile than it appears. It is not just armies, governments, or kings that sustain a society. It is food, its distribution, and the knowledge to manage it. Remove that, and the entire structure of life, law, and culture bends or breaks. By the time famine finally subsides, you understand something essential. Life continues not because of abundance or progress, but because people endure, adapt, and make difficult choices every day. Even when morality, law, and comfort vanish, survival persists, and in that persistence, society slowly rebuilds itself, one cautious decision at a time. And yet you cannot help but wonder, if a single harvest or a series of bad years can devastate entire populations, how resilient was medieval life, really? Was survival an act of human ingenuity or a fragile balance, always one bad season away from collapse? Story 4. Born to suffer childhood and death in the Dark Ages. You are born into a world where the concept of childhood is brief and fragile. Life expectancy is low, and infancy is a gauntlet rather than a phase of innocence. The moment you arrive, survival is already the first lesson. Medical knowledge is minimal. Midwives and family members assist birth, relying on experience, herbal remedies, and prayer. Complications that are easily treated today: breech births, infections, postpartum hemorrhage often prove fatal. 1 in 3 infants dies before their first birthday. Mothers, weakened by repeated pregnancies and scarce nutrition, face enormous risk as well. Your earliest memories are shaped by scarcity. You learn to cry softly because loud cries attract attention, not all of it friendly. Hunger is constant. Clothing is thin, blankets few. Winter is a real threat. Frostbite and hypothermia claim lives quietly without fanfare. Survival requires observation, patience, and obedience. Family life is harsh. Parents cannot indulge curiosity for long. Every action is measured against survival. If you wander into a river, someone risks leaving you behind to fetch tools or food. If you fall sick, they pray and give herbs, but outcomes are uncertain. Illness is nearly as deadly as famine itself. Dysentery, fevers, and infections lurk in households with unclean water and poor sanitation. Education is minimal. If you are a boy, you might learn basic skills in farming, herding, or craftwork. Girls learn household management, tending to younger siblings, milking animals, or spinning wool. Literacy is reserved for the rare family with access to clergy or monastery schools. Most knowledge passes orally. Skills are practical, survival-based, not academic. Play exists but lightly. Dolls, carved animals, and simple games appear, but they are brief distractions. Every day carries lessons in endurance, how to walk long distances, fetch water safely, carry loads, survive cold, and avoid disease. Childhood is short-lived because adulthood begins early. By 10, most children already contribute significantly to the household economy. Famine and disease are omnipresent. A single failed harvest can claim siblings or neighbors. Epidemics sweep villages silently, leaving gaps in families. Children grow up familiar with death, yet bewildered by its randomness. Funerals are frequent, often silent, and rarely offer closure. Loss becomes routine. The morality of daily life is pragmatic. Choices are measured by survival rather than ethics. If a neighbor's food is unprotected, stealing may be justified. If someone is too weak to travel or work, abandonment may occur. These actions are not celebrated but are sometimes necessary. Life teaches that necessity trumps convention. In towns, mortality differs slightly but remains stark. Sanitation is poor, water sources contaminated, and disease spreads quickly. In urban centers that survive the collapse of Roman infrastructure, epidemics hit children first. Families attempt isolation, but space is limited. Mortality rates for the youngest residents are staggering. Playgrounds do not exist. Education is sporadic. Work begins early, often as apprentices or laborers. Religion permeates childhood. Baptism is essential because unbaptized children risk eternal punishment in the beliefs of the time. Religious instruction is one of the few constants. Prayer, fasting, and ritual guide behavior, not necessarily for safety in this world, but for hope of protection in the next. Saints, legends, morality tales, and local superstitions mingle. Children learn that misfortune may be divine punishment, luck, or human error. They are taught to navigate these forces as best they can. Diet is precarious. Bread and porridge dominate meals, but famine years reduce them to acorn or bark variants. Milk and meat are luxuries. Children's bodies adapt slowly to scarcity, but are the first to suffer when rations shrink. Malnutrition weakens immunity, stunts growth, and leaves permanent scars visible even in adulthood. Survival depends on who eats first and who has the strength to take the scraps offered. Violence also touches childhood directly. Boys are trained in rudimentary defense and work with tools that can harm, while girls learn to manage household security. Raids, theft, and interpersonal feuds are never distant rumors. Families shield their children when possible, but training in practical survival is necessary from the earliest age. Death is the constant teacher. Siblings, neighbors, even parents may disappear unexpectedly. Funerals are routine, often brief, practical ceremonies. Mourning is tempered by necessity. Life moves on whether anyone is ready or not. Children internalize this lesson early. Attachment is vital yet fragile. Loss is expected. Survival is not guaranteed. Famine, disease, and mortality are interwoven with cultural norms. Stories, songs, and proverbs emphasize resilience, endurance, and obedience. Knowledge of herbs, seasonal patterns, and hidden dangers becomes part of collective memory. Children are indoctrinated, consciously or unconsciously, into understanding the precarity of existence. Childhood in the Dark Ages is therefore not a time of innocence but of preparation. You are trained to endure, observe, and adapt. You are taught through action, not lecture, that life is brief, dangerous, and requires constant awareness. Yet even in such harsh conditions, moments of curiosity and wonder persist. A river's shimmer, the first signs of spring, a bird's song, small marvels provide emotional sustenance. These glimpses of beauty are fleeting, yet vital, anchoring children to life amid constant danger. By the time you reach adolescence, much of the fragility of early childhood is behind you, but new challenges appear. Responsibility shifts from personal survival to contribution to family and community. Early exposure to mortality leaves a quiet resilience, practical, wary, and deeply attuned to the fragile rhythms of life. And still, the question lingers for every child born in this time. If survival is never guaranteed, if death is a constant companion, how do you find hope and even a reason to care before the world itself tests you again? Adolescence arrives quickly, marked not by celebration but by responsibility. By the time you are 10 or 12, your role in the household is firmly defined. Boys assist in the fields, learn basic carpentry, tend livestock, or prepare to defend the family if raiders appear. Girls carry water, care for younger siblings, churn butter, spin thread, and manage household supplies. The lines between work, survival, and social training blur. Childhood is fading, replaced by functional adulthood. Food remains scarce. Every meal is rationed, not by whim but by necessity. A single bad harvest can leave children to eat bark bread or acorns for weeks. Malnutrition stunts growth and weakens immunity, making adolescence a treacherous time. Those who survive gain strength slowly, while those who falter may never recover. Hunger teaches both patience and calculation. Who eats first? Who gets the larger portion? How to save enough for the sick or youngest? Disease stalks every village and town. Measles, smallpox, dysentery, and respiratory infections are common. If one child falls ill, the risk spreads quickly. Crowded living quarters accelerate contagion. Treatments are limited to herbs, prayer, and sometimes bloodletting. Mortality remains high. Survival requires knowledge: what plants can reduce fever, how to keep wounds clean, when to move a sick child outdoors or into a separate room. Adolescents often become caretakers for younger siblings or relatives, learning practical medicine under stress. Education, when it exists, is sparse and utilitarian. Reading and writing are privileges, generally reserved for children in households connected to the church or monasteries. Most instruction revolves around religion, practical skills, and moral behavior. You memorize prayers, observe ritual calendars, and learn stories designed to enforce obedience and social norms. Literacy, if attained, is secondary to survival skills: plowing, herding, cooking, and defending property. Work is relentless. Seasonal rhythms dominate life. Spring demands planting, summer, weeding, and tending, autumn, harvesting, winter, preparing for scarcity and cold. Adolescents are integrated fully into this cycle. Mistakes are costly. Drowning livestock, mismanaging tools, or misjudging a harvest can mean weeks of hunger. Responsibility arrives early because failure has immediate consequences. Violence remains an ever-present threat. Feuds between neighboring families or villages can erupt with little warning. Raiders from outside can attack settlements, sometimes burning homes and taking livestock. Adolescents learn to recognize danger, carry basic weapons, and sometimes participate in defense. Self-protection is a lifelong lesson, and the younger you learn it, the more likely you are to survive. Religion serves as both comfort and discipline. Saints' lives provide moral lessons, endurance, piety, and obedience in the face of suffering. Church rituals mark milestones, baptisms, confirmations, and festivals, but the emphasis is often on order and social cohesion, rather than celebration. Prayer is both a psychological shield and a social expectation. God is a presence in daily life, offering hope, but also a constant reminder of mortality and consequence. Social bonds are crucial. Adolescents rely heavily on family, neighbors, and peers for protection and survival knowledge. Friendships are pragmatic. Alliances form to gather firewood, hunt, or share scarce food. Trust is precious because betrayal can be deadly. Cooperation is essential, but so is vigilance. One wrong move can provoke retaliation, especially during times of scarcity. Mortality continues to shape experience. Funerals are frequent, and death is witnessed closely. Older children often help carry bodies, dig graves, or assist in preparation. Emotional detachment is a survival skill. Mourning cannot prevent starvation or disease. The emotional landscape is sharp and raw. Grief is constant, but life requires endurance. Even leisure is tied to survival. Play, when it occurs, is brief and practical. Running builds stamina. Climbing trains agility. Small games teach strategy or coordination. Music and storytelling persist, but often serve as mnemonic devices for knowledge about herbs, survival strategies, or local customs. Joy is functional, reinforcing memory and skills, not purely recreational. By mid-adolescence, your understanding of the world is clear. Life is precarious, mortality is omnipresent, and survival is an active, daily effort. You internalize hierarchy, understand kinship obligations, and appreciate the consequences of scarcity and violence. Planning is immediate and pragmatic. There is no room for idealism when hunger, disease, and death are around every corner. This environment fosters resilience, but also a quiet fatalism. You learn to act decisively, to endure discomfort, and to accept loss as part of life. At the same time, you begin to notice inequality. The stronger, richer, or more connected survive more reliably, while the weak are often left behind. These early lessons in survival, hierarchy, and pragmatism shape adulthood in profound ways. And yet, despite constant risk, adolescents find small spaces for curiosity and hope. Observing wildlife, experimenting with farming techniques, or learning a new skill provides a sense of control in a chaotic world. These moments are brief and fragile, but they matter. They give purpose and structure beyond mere survival. Which brings a lingering question to every young person in this era. If life is defined by hunger, work, and loss, how do you build dreams or even imagine a future when every day is a negotiation with death? Death is constant in early medieval childhood. By the time you reach adolescence, you have already seen siblings, cousins, and neighbors vanish without warning. Each death reinforces the precariousness of life, teaching lessons in endurance, timing, and caution. Families learn to manage grief carefully, because lingering sorrow can be fatal. A household weakened by despair is a household less able to survive scarcity, disease, or violence. Infant and child mortality are staggering. In some regions, 1/3 of children die before reaching 5. Those who survive often bear lifelong marks: stunted growth, weakened bones, or lingering illness caused by early malnutrition. Families learn to expect loss, Yet every death strikes personally. Parents prepare for it quietly. Infants are baptized quickly, names are chosen with care, and care is taken to preserve family continuity even amid uncertainty. Disease shapes experience as much as famine or violence. Smallpox, measles, dysentery, and respiratory infections kill indiscriminately. In towns and villages alike, adolescents learn rudimentary medical care herbs, poultices, steam treatments, or ritual prayers. Sometimes these treatments work. More often they fail. Understanding illness is less about science and more about observation. Which plants soothe fever, which actions aggravate wounds, which patterns suggest danger is spreading through a household. Survival is knowledge applied under pressure, and children often carry this burden themselves. Death also teaches social lessons. Funerals are practical ceremonies. Bodies are prepared and buried with efficiency, often without prolonged ritual. Mourning is brief. Life continues because the living must farm, hunt, or maintain the household. Emotional detachment becomes a survival skill. Yet, even amid routine, fear and grief are ever present. You learn that life is fragile, fleeting, and controlled by forces beyond your understanding or control. Religion permeates these experiences. Faith provides structure in the face of uncertainty. Saints' lives offer models of endurance, piety, and courage. Baptism, prayers, and holy observances mark each stage of growth, offering hope and a sense of order. For many, fear of divine judgment is intertwined with fear of death itself. Misfortune may be interpreted as punishment, illness as divine test, famine as moral trial. These beliefs shape behavior, guiding actions, and influencing risk assessments from an early age. By late adolescence, responsibility solidifies. You are expected to contribute to survival, carrying water, guarding fields, tending animals, or caring for younger siblings. Choices are practical: who to protect, when to travel, what to eat. Life is a series of calculations. Mistakes have immediate consequences. Death is never theoretical, it is always nearby. Even amid constant struggle, moments of humanity persist. Stories, songs, and practical games help children internalize knowledge about survival, plants, and social norms. Small joys: watching a bird, observing seasonal changes, learning a skill anchor you to life, providing a fragile emotional buffer against relentless hardship. These glimpses of beauty do not eliminate suffering, but they give endurance meaning. Adolescents also confront inequality. Families with more land, stronger kin networks, or access to lords, protection survive more reliably. Those without these advantages face higher risk. The lessons learned from observation, memory, and social networks are therefore as important as physical endurance. Understanding hierarchy, loyalty, and obligation becomes part of survival training. Mortality shapes psychology as well. Those who survive develop quiet resilience, an ability to manage stress, anticipate danger, and act decisively. They are wary but practical, cautious but observant. Trauma, normalized as part of life, becomes both teacher and shield. Life is defined not by comfort or security, but by how effectively one navigates loss, hunger, and violence. In essence, childhood and adolescence in the Dark Ages are training for survival under relentless uncertainty. Every day reinforces the impermanence of life, the necessity of vigilance, and the fragility of hope. Human development is compressed, learning accelerated by necessity. Innocence is brief, but adaptability and endurance are honed. By adulthood, you carry the cumulative weight of experience, loss, and skill. And yet, despite the relentless hardship, the period produces unexpected resilience. Societies survive famine, disease, and political chaos because children like you grow up capable of enduring, adapting, and transmitting knowledge. Families and communities perpetuate survival strategies across generations. In a harsh, unstable world, this capacity to endure is civilization's quiet triumph. The lingering question, however, is unavoidable. If childhood itself is a gauntlet of loss and preparation, and if survival depends on constant adaptation to danger, scarcity, and mortality. Then what does it mean to grow up human in a world where life is never guaranteed? Story 5. The Lords of War: How Small Kings and Warlords Shaped the Early Middle Ages. Imagine a land divided into countless pockets of authority, each ruled not by a distant king with armies, but by local lords whose power comes from weapons, loyalty, and reputation. You live in a patchwork of territories, each with its own rules, obligations, and threats. Borders are invisible in many cases, marked only by rivers, stones, or forests. Crossing them can be deadly. Respect for authority is conditional. Allegiance shifts with opportunity or necessity. These lords, sometimes called kings, sometimes warlords, hold power in very practical ways. They command armed retainers, control access to land, and enforce the rules of survival. Unlike later monarchs, their legitimacy is not guaranteed by inheritance alone. Prestige, military skill, and the ability to distribute spoils are often more important than bloodline. Strength determines whether your lord is obeyed or overthrown. You learn quickly who is powerful and who is weak. Observing their actions is education. A successful warlord protects followers, punishes betrayal, and rewards loyalty with plunder, land, or marriages. A failed one loses respect, allies, and eventually life itself. Reputation spreads faster than news. Stories of victories, raids, or betrayals circulate, shaping who dares ally or resist. Fortifications are simple but effective. Earthen mounds, wooden palisades, or small stone keeps provide both refuge and symbolic authority. A hill with a lord's hall is a statement. This is where power lives, where decisions are made, where justice or vengeance emanates. The lord's hall is also the center of economy and culture, where food is stored, gifts exchanged, and rituals performed. You see your lord as protector, judge, and sometimes predator. Lords do not rule alone. They rely on networks of warriors, kin, and advisors. Military retainers are essential. A lord with few soldiers is vulnerable. Loyalty is enforced through reward, fear, and kinship ties. Mercenary bands or allied families supplement strength when available, but these relationships are fragile. Betrayal is common, and violence often comes unexpectedly. Raiding is central to power. Land yields limited resources. Wealth comes not only from taxes or tribute, but from attacking neighbors, seizing livestock, and capturing prisoners. Successful raids enhance a lord's prestige, reinforce loyalty, and create opportunities for alliances through marriage or negotiation. Failure, however, invites attack. Feuds are therefore entwined with politics. Survival depends on aggression, strategy, and timing. Economy and subsistence are inseparable from warfare. Farmers pay tribute for protection. Craftsmen offer skills in exchange for security. Lords redistribute these resources to maintain loyalty. Food, weapons, and land are both practical assets and instruments of influence. The ability to feed and arm followers often determines whether a lord survives the season. Churches and monasteries provide additional complexity. Religious institutions can legitimize authority by blessing leaders or mediating disputes. Monasteries are centers of knowledge and production, but also repositories of wealth. Some lords exploit them for resources. Others protect them to bolster prestige and divine favor. Alliances between warlords and the church are transactional, mutually beneficial, and often temporary. In this environment, law is personal. Kings may issue codes, but enforcement is local. Feuds, revenge killings, and raids are tolerated if they maintain balance. Negotiation, gift-giving, and hostage exchange are as important as military action. The line between diplomacy and warfare is thin. Survival depends on knowing not only your lord but neighboring lords, their strengths, weaknesses, and inclinations. Families are central to power. Marriage creates alliances. Inheritance consolidates land and influence. Blood is both political and practical. Children of powerful lords are raised to wield weapons, manage estates, and navigate a network of obligations that spans villages, forests, and rivers. Women often manage resources, negotiate truces, or act as symbols of alliance, while men learn to fight, command, and negotiate. You quickly notice that power is ephemeral. A lord who commands respect in spring may be dead by autumn. Disease, defeat, betrayal, or famine can erase influence overnight. Maintaining authority requires constant vigilance, strategic planning, and ruthless decision-making. Weakness is dangerous. Even minor miscalculations can trigger revolt or raid. For ordinary people, these lords are both protection and threat. Following a strong lord may ensure security and access to resources. Choosing poorly or backing the wrong claimant can mean dispossession, starvation, or death. Loyalty is practical, not sentimental. Survival is political as much as agricultural. Warfare shapes culture. Festivals celebrate victories, storytelling commemorates raids, and symbols of power banners, weapons, horses carry meaning far beyond their material value. Fear and respect coexist in the minds of those who live under these small kings. A single misstep can shift a household from security to vulnerability. Despite the violence, some continuity exists. Lifestyles remain agrarian. Communities farm, herd, craft, and trade. Lords require labor, and the exchange between ruler and ruled maintains daily life. But that life is always mediated by threat. Success is fragile. Protection is conditional. Alliances are tactical. The Dark Ages are less dark because of absence, and more because danger is woven into every transaction. Every village, every household, every child grows up aware of this precarious network. Even if you never wield a sword, the logic of survival, loyalty, vigilance, negotiation, and caution is internalized from birth. Power in these times is personal, immediate, and relentless. And yet you wonder, if every lord balances strength and fear to maintain control, and every decision can spark death or loyalty, then what truly defines leadership in a world where violence is law and survival is constant? Power is never static. A lord who seems invincible in one season can become vulnerable the next. Success depends not only on the strength of arms, but also on the subtle mechanics of alliances, marriages, and negotiation. Understanding these relationships is as vital as knowing how to wield a sword. Alliances are fragile bargains, often cemented with gifts, land, or marriage. A daughter married to a neighboring lord may prevent an attack or provoke one if the alliance is perceived as threatening. Sons are sometimes sent as hostages to guarantee loyalty. You learn that loyalty is transactional. It can be bought, traded, or coerced. The right alliance can expand a lord's influence dramatically. The wrong one can invite ruin. Betrayal is constant. A trusted ally might turn against you if circumstances shift. Power is measured in both battlefield victories and the ability to anticipate treachery. Chroniclers from Anglo-Saxon England and Frankish kingdoms report countless examples of lords murdered by supposed friends, castles captured while the lord slept, or armies abandoned at critical moments. Survival demands constant vigilance. You must evaluate not only strength, but also temperament, patience, and ambition. Raiding remains central to this system. Lords rarely wage full-scale war over territory alone. Instead, small-scale raids secure wealth, prestige, and leverage. Livestock, grain, and captives are the currency of influence. A successful raid demonstrates strength to allies and enemies alike, but failure is catastrophic. Raids require planning, manpower, and timing. A poorly executed strike can invite counterattack, loss of prestige, or rebellion from your own followers. Mercenaries and retinues play critical roles. Not every lord has enough loyal followers to enforce authority or project power. Hired soldiers fill gaps, but loyalty is conditional. Mercenaries fight for payment, not principle. If funds run out or if opportunity arises elsewhere, they may switch sides. This unpredictability adds layers of complexity to the management of power. A lord must anticipate not only enemy moves but the shifting motivations of his own forces. Resource control underpins all military and political strategy. Grain stores, livestock, water sources, and forests are both sustenance and leverage. Control of fertile land enables you to feed armies. Access to trade routes allows negotiation or bribery. Conversely, losing control of key resources undermines credibility and authority. Even a powerful lord can fall if followers go hungry or if his stores are insufficient to reward loyalty. Churches and monasteries serve as both allies and potential adversaries. Clergy can legitimize authority by blessing campaigns, mediating disputes, or chronicling victories. Monasteries, with their wealth, literacy, and networks, are strategic partners or tempting targets. A clever lord exploits religious institutions to strengthen influence while avoiding the wrath of the church, balancing material gain against spiritual authority. Territorial expansion is opportunistic. Borders are porous. Rivers, forests, and hills define limits more than lines on a map. Lords take advantage of neighbors' weaknesses, famine, disease, or internal dispute. Success depends on timing, knowledge of terrain, and careful observation of local power structures. Even minor skirmishes carry high stakes. A defeat can embolden rivals and destabilize alliances across the region. Leadership is a constant negotiation between fear and loyalty. A lord who rules through terror may command obedience, but only until a stronger rival appears. One who rules through generosity must maintain resources to reward followers consistently or risk defection. The balance is delicate. Too harsh and loyalty falters. Too soft and enemies sense weakness. Observers, commoners, soldiers, neighboring lords always measure, always calculate. Ceremony and symbolism reinforce authority. Feasts, gift exchanges, and displays of martial skill communicate power and competence. Armies must be well-equipped, banners visible, and strategies public enough to convey capability. Reputation is not abstract. It is tangible, measured by the success of raids, the display of wealth, and the fear or respect instilled in others. Ordinary people experience this hierarchy directly. Their security, labor obligations, and even survival hinge on the decisions of these lords. Supporting the wrong side, failing to provide tribute, or witnessing perceived weakness can invite violence. Life is interwoven with politics. Farming, trade, and domestic work exist within a network of shifting alliances and threats. Even with all this complexity, power is precarious. Illness, whether famine or betrayal, can unravel influence in a single season. Lords adapt by maintaining redundant alliances, rewarding loyalty, and observing competitors constantly. Their success is a combination of force, strategy, and careful social calculation. For you, as an observer or a dependent of these lords, the lesson is unmistakable. Survival is not simply about fighting or farming. It is about understanding human networks, timing, and the fragile logic of fear and favor. The early medieval world is not lawless chaos, it is a web of conditional loyalty, strategic violence, and resource management, where each decision ripples outward in ways both visible and invisible. And still you wonder, if loyalty is transactional, alliances fragile, and life constantly threatened, then what separates a lord from a warlord or a king from a tyrant in a world defined by survival and the balance of fear and respect? Time passes, and the immediate chaos of skirmishes, raids, and shifting alliances begins to leave a more lasting mark on society. The lords of war, warlords, small kings, and regional rulers shape not only battles and borders, but culture, governance, and survival strategies for generations. Their legacies are embedded in law, loyalty, and the rhythms of everyday life. The first legacy is structural. Many of the fortifications, settlements, and administrative practices developed to support a warlord endure for centuries. A hilltop fort may evolve into a town. The Lord's Hall becomes a center for trade, justice, and local governance. Roads cleared for raids or troop movements facilitate commerce long after the fighting ends. Even seemingly transient actions, collecting tribute, standardizing weights, or negotiating alliances, lay foundations for more permanent systems of authority. Military organization leaves its mark as well. Armies are no longer ad hoc mobs. They become trained, loyal bands with internal hierarchy, discipline, and methods of provisioning. Young warriors are trained from adolescence, learning tactics, weapon use, and survival skills. These practices are codified over time into more formal military traditions that influence later kingdoms. The emphasis on loyalty, hierarchy, and rapid response continues to shape local defense centuries later. Economically, the demands of warlords stimulate production and specialization. Skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, and millers are valued for their ability to equip and sustain armies. Trade networks expand to supply food, weapons, and luxury goods. The pressure to reward followers or bribe allies encourages accumulation and redistribution of wealth, embedding economic patterns into regional life. Even ordinary people internalize this logic. Survival often depends on the efficiency of work, the clever management of resources, and the ability to navigate shifting power dynamics. Political culture changes permanently. The constant need for negotiation, alliances, and loyalty management teaches subtle diplomacy. Rules of engagement, marriage alliances, hostage exchanges, and the calculation of risk versus reward all become normalized. Success is measured not only in battlefield victories, but in the ability to maintain networks of obligation and influence. Governance becomes relational, based on trust, fear, and calculation as much as law or tradition. Yet the world remains dangerous. The same networks that sustain power also threaten it. Betrayal, famine, disease, and natural disaster remain constants. Lords who fail to adapt are replaced, but adaptation is inherited. Children trained in these households internalize the logic of power early. To survive, you must anticipate danger, negotiate carefully, and leverage every available resource. This knowledge shapes generations, creating resilience even amid instability. Socially, the warlord's world defines the boundaries of loyalty, justice, and obligation. Violence becomes ritualized and strategic rather than purely chaotic. Raids, feuds, and military campaigns are not random. They follow rules of risk, reward, and reputation. Ordinary people learn to navigate this hierarchy. Their labor, tribute, and allegiance are both survival strategies and forms of participation in power structures they did not create but must respect. Religious institutions, once intermediaries or legitimizers of authority, are profoundly affected. Warlords support monasteries or churches to gain prestige, blessing, and moral legitimacy. In turn, religious centers document events, advise rulers, and preserve cultural memory. This partnership reinforces stability and continuity even as lords rise and fall. Churches become repositories of law, knowledge, and cultural norms that persist long after the immediate violence fades. The ultimate lesson of the warlords is adaptability. Power is never absolute. Legitimacy is contingent. Networks are fragile, and survival depends on constant vigilance. Those who thrive are those who understand not only how to fight, but how to persuade, reward, intimidate, and negotiate. Leadership is a blend of martial skill, resource management, social intelligence, and psychological insight. For ordinary people, the lessons are equally vital. Life under warlords teaches risk assessment, negotiation, and careful observation. Trust is calibrated. Alliances, even among peasants, are strategic. Survival requires flexibility, pragmatism, and patience. The logic of power percolates through society, shaping behavior at every level. The warlord's era may feel brutal, chaotic, and unstable, but it produces resilience, skill, and networks of authority that persist into the later medieval period. Castles evolve, armies formalize, law codes solidify, and social hierarchies stabilize. Modern historians often focus on kings, empires, and battles, but the lessons of the small lords, the tactical genius, the survival strategies, the careful management of loyalty reveal the foundations of state formation, governance, and social order. Yet a lingering question remains, one that echoes across centuries. If power is always conditional, if loyalty is transactional, And if life depends on constant negotiation with danger, then what truly separates a ruler from the ruled in a world where survival is the ultimate law, and where death is only one misstep away? The Lords of War teach us that history is not shaped solely by kings or battles, but by the careful, often brutal management of people, resources, and relationships. In their rise and fall, you see the delicate balance between fear and respect, chaos and order, a balance that defines human societies long after the swords are sheathed. Story 6. The Hidden Lives of Serfs' Labor, Survival, and Rebellion in Medieval Villages. Imagine being tied to the soil from birth. You are born into a world where your labor is not optional, your freedom is limited, and the land itself dictates the rhythm of your existence. You belong not to yourself, but to the estate overseen by a lord, sometimes distant, sometimes nearby, always demanding. You are a serf, the backbone of early medieval society, yet invisible in most chronicles. Your day begins before sunrise. The air is cold and damp, especially in spring and autumn. You walk to the fields to tend crops, feed livestock, or repair infrastructure. Work is relentless and seasonal. Planting, weeding, harvesting, and preparing for winter dictate your life. Even a minor misstep, forgetting to repair a fence or misjudging a sowing schedule, can mean loss of crops, punishment, or starvation. Survival requires vigilance and skill, even in seemingly ordinary tasks. Diet is basic, monotonous, and often inadequate. Bread, porridge, and vegetables dominate meals. Meat is a rarity, reserved for festivals, harvest celebrations, or gifts from the Lord. In famine years, even bread becomes sparse, replaced by bark or acorn flour. Children learn early that food is scarce. They eat quickly, often in silence, knowing that waste or indulgence is dangerous. Malnutrition shapes the body and mind. Weakness is common, yet labor demands strength. You adapt, but the adaptation is slow and unforgiving. Housing is simple, a small timber-framed cottage, often one room for the entire family. Floors are dirt or simple stone, roofs thatched. Firewood is limited, warmth must be rationed carefully. In winter, frost bites. In summer, heat and insects plague life. Clean water is not guaranteed. Illness spreads quickly. These conditions are ordinary, not exceptional. They are the framework in which survival unfolds. Obligations to your lord are numerous. You labor directly on the lord's domain, provide a share of your own crops, maintain infrastructure, and sometimes serve in defense or militia. Punishments for failure are immediate: fines, extra labor, corporal punishment. Justice is administered by the lord or his steward, often arbitrarily. Appeals are limited, and survival depends as much on favor as fairness. Family life is practical. Children contribute early. By age 7, they work in the fields, tend animals, or help in household chores. Adolescents learn not only labor skills but social navigation: how to negotiate with the Lord's overseer, how to avoid punishment, and how to cooperate with neighbors while protecting family resources. Childhood is brief. Training for survival is continuous. Even in harsh conditions, serfs create culture. Storytelling, songs, and seasonal festivals maintain social bonds and transmit knowledge. Harvest celebrations, local saints, days, and communal gatherings provide rare relief. Humor, superstition, and folklore persist, shaping resilience and shared memory. These practices are not trivial. They are tools for psychological survival, maintaining morale amid scarcity and toil. Resistance exists, even if quietly. Subtle acts failing to fully deliver tribute, overworking animals, or misreporting yields allow small measures of agency. Rebellion occurs rarely but violently. Chroniclers from Frankish kingdoms and Anglo-Saxon England recount peasant uprisings. Villages refuse to deliver dues, attack overseers, or flee estates during crises. These acts are exceptional because the risks are high. Failure often results in execution, dispossession, or worse. Religious life is central but dual in function. The church offers ritual, moral instruction, and hope of eternal reward, yet it also reinforces hierarchy. Tithes, mandatory attendance, and ecclesiastical authority mirror the control of secular lords. Faith provides comfort and structure, but also reminds serfs of obligations, both temporal and spiritual. Mortality shapes experience. Disease, famine, and accidents claim lives frequently. Adults, children, and infants alike face constant risk. Funerals are brief and practical. Grief is tempered by necessity. Every household internalizes the fragility of life, teaching resilience and caution. Knowledge matters as survival currency. Knowing how to treat illness with herbs, predict weather patterns, store grain, or maintain tools can determine life or death. Elders are repositories of this practical wisdom. Oral tradition preserves methods that written records often overlook. This hidden knowledge forms a web of adaptation critical to endurance. For ordinary serfs, life is measured not by ambition but by survival, cooperation, and subtle navigation of power. Every action, labor, negotiation, obedience, or quiet defiance is a calculation in the constant equation of risk and reward. You learn that survival is as much social intelligence as physical strength. And yet, despite the hardships, a question lingers for every serf and observer alike. If your life is determined by birth, labor, and obligations beyond your control, how much room is left for choice, for freedom, or even for hope that tomorrow might be different? Life for a serf is a constant negotiation between work and rest, obedience and self-preservation, survival and dignity. The demands of the Lord are relentless. You rise before sunrise, labor in the fields, tend animals, repair fences, and return exhausted, yet the day is never done. Even chores that appear mundane, mending tools, storing grain, or preparing firewood, are survival critical. Neglect or failure carries penalties, not only for you but for your family. Yet within these constraints, subtle strategies emerge. Survival requires ingenuity. You might plant a few extra vegetables in hidden patches, store small caches of grain, or quietly trade with neighbors. These acts are small, often unnoticed, yet they sustain life. Every action is calibrated to avoid detection while maximizing resources. You learn to read overseers, to anticipate punishment, and to measure the limits of acceptable disobedience. Work is structured by seasons but also by necessity. Planting requires skill. Understanding soil, timing, and crop rotation is essential to prevent total loss. Harvest is exhausting. Delays or mismanagement risk famine. The labor of the community is collective, yet individual households must ensure their own survival. A mistake by one family can have cascading consequences. Cooperation is essential, but so is vigilance. You watch your neighbors as closely as your own fields. Food scarcity is a constant reality. The diet of a serf is simple: coarse bread, porridge, root vegetables, occasional dairy, and the rare bit of meat. Hunger is tolerated, rationed, and normalized. During lean years, improvisation is necessary. Wild greens, nuts, berries, and herbs supplement meals. These adaptations are critical to survival, though they leave permanent physical marks: malnutrition, stunted growth, and susceptibility to disease. Disease is pervasive. Contaminated water, close quarters, and lack of hygiene make outbreaks common. Dysentery, respiratory infections, and fevers kill indiscriminately. Knowledge of herbal remedies is valuable. Elders teach which plants reduce fever, ease pain, or heal wounds. Children learn these lessons early because each household must be partially self-sufficient in care. Surviving disease requires observation, timing, and sometimes luck. The social order imposes additional pressures. Lords demand tribute in the form of labor, crops, or livestock. Failing to meet obligations invites punishment, fines, extra work, or physical coercion. You learn to calculate the minimal acceptable compliance, balancing survival with the limits of submission. Even small acts of resistance, harvesting secretly, bending rules, or delaying work become tactical decisions. Rebellion is rare but remembered. Chronicles note village uprisings in Frankish kingdoms and Anglo-Saxon England, usually crushed swiftly. Religion is intertwined with social and survival obligations. Attendance, tithes, and observance are required, but spiritual instruction also provides a framework for understanding hardship. Saints, stories, parables, and prayers reinforce obedience but offer solace. Faith is practical and psychological. It structures time, encourages endurance, and provides hope, even when material conditions are bleak. Children are trained early in labor and compliance. Boys work in fields, tend livestock, and learn tools. Girls care for the household, assist with siblings, and acquire skills necessary to manage future family responsibilities. Childhood is brief. Training for survival dominates every day. Observation of adults teaches lessons about negotiation, compliance, and discreet resistance. Violence is always a background threat. Conflicts over resources, disputes between families, or raiding by external forces can erupt suddenly. Serfs may be caught in the crossfire, punished for perceived disloyalty, or forced to fight in local militia. Knowledge of local terrain, hidden paths, and strategic retreat becomes part of survival strategy. Yet even in this rigid system, human ingenuity emerges. Serfs develop cooperative networks, share tools, warn of disease, and organize communal labor. Humor, folklore, and songs are used to relieve stress and transmit practical knowledge. The village functions as both social safety net and moral compass, even under the constant pressure of scarcity and authority. Rebellion, when it occurs, is often opportunistic. A weak lord, famine, or plague can spark uprisings, where serfs collectively withhold labor, attack officials, or flee estates. Chroniclers rarely highlight these events in detail, but archaeology and legal documents reveal their frequency. The risk is immense. Failure often results in death, fines, or loss of land. Success is fleeting, yet even unsuccessful attempts demonstrate agency, courage, and strategic thought within a tightly constrained society. For a serf, life is a constant calculation. Every choice: how much labor to perform, how to share scarce food, when to obey or resist, affects survival. Physical endurance, social intelligence, and psychological resilience are equally necessary. Life is constrained, yet within these constraints, strategies emerge that preserve both life and a sense of dignity. And yet, the unresolved question remains. If so much of life is predetermined by birth, obligation, and circumstance, how do ordinary people carve out agency, meaning, or hope in a world where survival itself is a daily battle? Even in the shadow of lords and warlords, the lives of serfs exert subtle influence over medieval society. You are bound to the land, bound to obligations, but not entirely without power. Survival itself is a form of quiet resistance, and the strategies you develop ripple outward, shaping the social and economic structure of entire regions. Daily life is relentless. Dawn begins with the tending of animals, maintenance of fences, and preparation of fields. You carry water, repair roofs, and feed families, all while meeting the demands of the Lord. Labor is not optional. Failure has immediate consequences. But within these constraints, you make tactical decisions. You ration food carefully, store surplus grain in hidden caches, and cultivate small personal plots. These small acts of resourcefulness allow you to survive where rigid obedience alone would fail. Community becomes essential. Villagers share knowledge about planting, disease prevention, and hidden food sources. Elders teach younger generations which herbs alleviate illness, how to identify edible wild plants, or how to predict seasonal patterns. Children learn early that observation, memory, and cooperation are survival tools. Networks of kinship and friendship provide both protection and opportunity. Rebellion, when it occurs, is rarely spontaneous. Chroniclers record peasant uprisings across Frankish kingdoms, Anglo-Saxon England, and Scandinavia. These revolts are often responses to famine, excessive labor demands, or unjust treatment. They are strategic, targeting moments of lordly weakness after a defeat, during a famine, or following political instability. Though many uprisings are suppressed, they demonstrate that even the most constrained individuals exercise agency when conditions allow. Religious institutions also intersect with survival strategies. Churches and monasteries provide food, medical care, and shelter in times of famine. Clergy mediate disputes, sometimes advocating on behalf of serfs. Faith offers psychological solace, but it also reinforces social hierarchy. Yet clever serfs navigate these institutions to gain small advantages: delayed tithes, extra provisions, or protection from predatory lords. Mortality remains high, shaping how households plan for the future. Infant and child deaths are common. Surviving children inherit responsibility early. Labor, survival strategies, and knowledge transmission are part of their education. By adolescence, most children understand the logic of obligation, resource management, and subtle negotiation with authority. Death teaches pragmatism and patience, as families adapt to loss and scarcity. Despite hardships, moments of culture and joy persist. Storytelling, song, and ritual embed knowledge and moral lessons. Seasonal festivals allow communities to reinforce cohesion, celebrate survival, and transmit wisdom. Humor, folklore, and social games offer relief, sustaining mental health and reinforcing identity. These small cultural practices are the threads that weave resilience into the fabric of daily life. The economic contributions of serfs shape regional development. Their labor sustains crops, livestock, and infrastructure. Markets thrive when surplus exists, and trade networks expand as a result of agricultural productivity. Even small-scale acts, bartering tools, exchanging labor, or participating in village craft production, affect the broader economy. Serfs, though constrained, are active agents in sustaining medieval society. The quiet influence of serfs is also political. By negotiating obligations, performing covert resistance, or participating in collective action, they shape the limits of lordly authority. Lords cannot extract resources indefinitely without risking unrest. Over time, customary rights and tacit understandings emerge: rules about land use, labor obligations, and mutual support that stabilize social relations. These invisible contracts between lord and peasant are a form of social regulation, built from experience and necessity rather than decree. Even after rebellion fails, lessons endure. Communities remember which strategies work, which leaders are weak, and how to navigate power without provoking total destruction. Knowledge of survival, loyalty, and negotiation is transmitted across generations. This continuity ensures that even the most constrained households carry the cumulative wisdom of centuries. Life as a serf is defined by tension, bound by law and custom, yet resourceful in survival, subject to authority, yet capable of subtle negotiation, surrounded by danger, yet capable of joy and resilience. Ordinary people are rarely credited in history, but their endurance is the foundation upon which medieval society rests. Without the labor, cunning, and persistence of serfs, even the most powerful lords and kings could not maintain their positions. And so, the final question lingers. If the lives of the majority, the silent laborers, the invisible planners, the resilient survivors shape the economy, culture, and stability of entire regions, then who truly holds power in a world defined by scarcity, obligation, and survival? Is it the lords who command armies, or the serfs whose daily labor sustains every victory and every feast? Story 7. Plague and Pestilence: How Disease Shaped the Medieval World. Imagine living in a world where danger is not always visible. Fields, forests, and villages teem with life, yet hidden among them lurk pathogens that can end entire communities in weeks. Disease is a constant, invisible force shaping life, society, and survival in ways far more profound than war or famine alone. Medical understanding is rudimentary. You rely on midwives, herbalists, and prayers. Illness is often interpreted as divine punishment or imbalance of humors, rather than the result of bacteria, viruses, or parasites. Remedies include herbal poultices, leeches, and spells. The effectiveness is inconsistent, leaving survival partly to chance. Hospitals, as we understand them today, are rare. Care is home-based. usually provided by family or neighbors, often without specialized knowledge. In towns and villages, population density amplifies risk. Shared wells, crowded living spaces, and limited sanitation create ideal conditions for disease to spread. A single infected person can quickly become the source of multiple deaths. Epidemics are not isolated events. They are recurring cycles, sometimes wiping out a third or more of a community. You learn quickly that proximity to others carries both benefit and danger. The Black Death is the most infamous example, but smaller-scale plagues shape daily life as well. Venice, a hub of trade, frequently experiences outbreaks due to ships carrying infected rats and goods. Rural regions are not spared. Typhus, dysentery, and influenza sweep through villages, claiming the young, weak, and elderly. Fear becomes constant, though often muted because survival is already a daily struggle. Food scarcity compounds disease. Malnutrition weakens immunity, making communities more vulnerable. Years of bad harvest intensify the impact of epidemics. Families ration food, hide supplies, and prioritize survival of the strongest members. Children and the elderly are most at risk. The logic of survival is brutal. Those who can work survive. Those who cannot often perish. Sanitation is minimal. Waste is discarded near homes or in open streets. Water sources are often contaminated. Rats and fleas proliferate unnoticed. Infections spread silently. Hygiene is a luxury. It is not possible for everyone to maintain, especially during winter or famine. You observe patterns empirically. Contaminated water leads to outbreaks. Rotting food makes people ill. Crowding accelerates death, but causation is not fully understood. Quarantine is occasionally practiced, though inconsistently. Entire households may be isolated after an outbreak. Trade may halt temporarily, yet enforcement is uneven. Often, fear spreads faster than knowledge, and superstition guides behavior. Pilgrimages, prayers, and religious processions are both coping mechanisms and vectors for disease, illustrating the tension between faith, survival, and science, or the lack thereof. The social impact of disease is immense. Labor shortages shift power dynamics. Surviving peasants demand better conditions, wages, or land access. Lords who cannot maintain order face rebellion or economic collapse. Markets are disrupted, travel becomes risky, and political alliances strain. Disease is not merely a biological event. It is a structural one, reshaping economies, societies, and governance. Childhood and family life are deeply affected. Children lose parents or siblings regularly, reinforcing a constant awareness of mortality. Families internalize practices for protection, avoiding large gatherings, using herbs, and maintaining minimal sanitation. Older children learn rudimentary care techniques and must assume adult responsibilities rapidly if parents fall ill. The experience instills caution, resilience, and pragmatic risk assessment. Religion interacts with disease in complex ways. Clergy provide comfort, prayers, and ritual, but they also interpret epidemics as divine punishment. Saints, intercessions, holy relics, and festivals are invoked to halt outbreaks. Pilgrimages both console the faithful and spread infection further. Faith offers psychological support, yet it can paradoxically increase risk, illustrating the entwined roles of belief, behavior, and survival. Travel, trade, and warfare become risk-laden activities. Merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims carry disease across regions, connecting distant communities in unintended ways. Trade hubs like Venice, Constantinople, and Paris act as both centers of commerce and accelerants of contagion. Knowledge of who and what to avoid is critical, yet incomplete. Survival depends as much on observation and caution as on immunity. Even small-scale outbreaks influence politics. Lords may lose key retainers or soldiers, forcing rapid adaptation. Administrative continuity is threatened. Chroniclers often link epidemics to shifts in leadership, realignment of alliances, and rural revolts, showing that disease is as significant in shaping medieval history as armies and kings. And so, the unavoidable question arises. In a world where invisible forces can kill indiscriminately, how do societies adapt, govern, and survive when even the strongest lords, the largest armies, and the most faithful prayers cannot guarantee safety? As epidemics sweep through communities, societies are forced to adapt in ways that ripple far beyond immediate survival. Life under the constant threat of disease teaches both caution and ingenuity, reshaping social structures, labor systems, and even the psychological landscape of entire regions. Ordinary people develop strategies to endure. Families adjust diets, relying on grains and root vegetables that can be stored for months. Herbs and natural remedies, sage, thyme, willow bark, become essential tools, learned from elders and shared within villages. Children grow up understanding both the importance of observation and the fragility of life. Simple practices, like boiling water, fumigating homes, or isolating the sick, become rudimentary forms of epidemiology. Communities respond collectively. Villages may temporarily quarantine households or restrict movement, relying on social norms rather than written law. Markets are suspended, communal gatherings delayed, and travel limited. These measures are unevenly enforced, but they illustrate the emergence of societal mechanisms to manage invisible threats. Even when imperfect, adaptation becomes embedded in daily life. Labor shortages resulting from disease transform social and economic hierarchies. Fields go untended, livestock may die, and trade slows. Survivors gain leverage. Peasants and serfs can negotiate better terms, demand higher wages, or claim more land. Lords must adapt or face rebellion. Entire economic patterns shift, demonstrating that disease is not just biological, it is structural, influencing labor, production, and distribution. Religious institutions occupy a dual role. Clergy provide spiritual comfort, administer care, and interpret plagues as moral lessons. They reinforce hierarchy and obedience while simultaneously offering aid. Monasteries sometimes act as hospitals, caring for the sick and distributing food. Pilgrimages, however, present paradoxes. While offering hope, they also accelerate contagion. Faith becomes both a tool of psychological endurance and an unwitting conduit for disease. Childhood and family structures are deeply affected. Children lose parents, siblings, or mentors, forcing rapid assumption of adult responsibilities. Households adapt to these losses, rearranging labor, sharing resources, and training the young in survival skills. The cumulative knowledge of what works and what kills becomes part of collective memory, transmitted orally through generations. Even failure leaves lessons. Trade and travel are particularly precarious. Merchants and pilgrims act as vectors, connecting distant regions through roads, rivers, and ports. Cities like Venice, Constantinople, and London are nodes of both wealth and vulnerability. Knowledge of safe routes, timing of travel, and local outbreaks is crucial. Survivors develop informal networks to share intelligence, creating the early equivalents of public health strategies, even if based on observation and superstition. Military campaigns are profoundly impacted. Armies lose soldiers to disease faster than to combat. Sieges become deadly not only from starvation but from plague. Lords must plan carefully, balancing ambition with the risk of mass illness. The success of a campaign often hinges on timing relative to epidemics, making disease a decisive factor in medieval warfare. Societies develop long-term adaptations. Laws gradually codify quarantine measures, sanitation standards, and obligations for care. Guilds and trade networks formalize hygiene practices to protect laborers and ensure continuity of production. Knowledge of remedies, isolation, and observation becomes embedded in daily routines. Even small habits, washing hands, ventilating homes, rotating crops, reduce risk and become part of cultural memory. Psychologically, the presence of death is pervasive. Communities internalize mortality. Resilience and pragmatism become necessary traits. Survival is not only physical but emotional. Fear is constant, but so is adaptability. Humor, ritual, and storytelling serve as coping mechanisms. These practices sustain morale and transmit essential survival knowledge. Ultimately, disease transforms the social contract. Survival depends not only on individual skill, but on community cohesion, resource management, and the ability to anticipate and adapt to invisible threats. Ordinary people gain agency indirectly, through labor negotiations, migration, or survival strategies. They influence the economic and political landscape in ways that lords and kings cannot fully control. And yet, as you observe these patterns, one question looms. If invisible forces can strike unpredictably, reshaping societies, economies, and hierarchies, then to what extent are human decisions truly in control, and how much of history is written by disease itself? Over time, the shadow of disease leaves a permanent imprint on the medieval world. Epidemics are not fleeting disruptions. They reshape demographics, economies, social hierarchies, and cultural memory. The Black Death, waves of typhus, smallpox, and influenza, though invisible, become agents of transformation, rewriting how people live, work, and relate to each other. Population decline is immediate and staggering. In some regions, up to half of the inhabitants perish during a single outbreak. Entire villages vanish, fields go fallow, and towns shrink. Labor becomes scarce. Survivors suddenly find themselves in a position of leverage. Serfs can demand better terms, higher wages, or freedom from oppressive obligations. Lords who fail to adjust lose not only labor but influence. In this way, disease reshapes the balance of power between classes, often in ways that warfare alone cannot. Economic structures shift as well. Markets adapt to shortages, and the redistribution of land and wealth accelerates. Artisans, farmers, and traders gain importance because their skills are critical to recovery. Surviving communities prioritize productivity, storage, and careful management of resources. Even small adjustments, rotating crops more efficiently, storing grain for multiple seasons, or reorganizing labor, become lessons embedded in tradition. Survival strategy becomes a form of economic innovation. Religion and culture are profoundly affected. Plagues encourage reflection on mortality, ethics, and divine will. Communities construct rituals, memorials, and festivals to cope with death and grief. Saints, cults, and miracle stories proliferate, offering both solace and moral guidance. Pilgrimages, while risky, become acts of devotion and hope. Artistic expression, stained glass, illuminated manuscripts, and storytelling reflects the omnipresence of disease and mortality, shaping collective consciousness. Childhood and family structures are transformed. Many children grow up without parents or older siblings, inheriting responsibilities early. Adolescents learn agricultural, medical, and survival skills from a young age. Knowledge of disease management, herbs, isolation practices, timing of planting, and storage is passed down through oral tradition. Families adapt, creating redundancy in skills and knowledge to withstand future outbreaks. These adaptations increase long-term resilience. Political structures are reshaped. Lords who survive epidemics must negotiate new labor realities. They may grant freedoms, redistribute land, or reduce obligations to maintain stability. Cities and towns sometimes gain autonomy because depopulation weakens feudal oversight. Epidemics catalyze legal and administrative innovations. Regulations for quarantine, burial practices, and care of the sick become codified. Disease becomes a driver of institutional development. Military campaigns are forever altered. Armies must account for loss to disease in planning. Sieges, troop movements, and recruitment are calibrated to minimize exposure. Strategic timing, sanitation, and contingency planning become critical components of military logistics. Disease is as decisive as combat, and generals who ignore it risk catastrophic failure. The psychological imprint is enduring. Communities internalize the fragility of life. Rituals, customs, and humor serve as coping mechanisms. People learn caution, adaptability, and pragmatic risk assessment. The ever-present awareness of mortality shapes behavior, decision-making, and cultural norms, fostering resilience even amid repeated crises. Urban and rural landscapes change physically as well. Abandoned fields and depopulated villages are consolidated or repurposed. Infrastructure is adapted to smaller populations. Trade networks are reorganized. Ports, roads, and markets adjust to demographic realities. Every epidemic leaves material traces in the organization of settlements and the distribution of resources. Even the seemingly invisible patterns of immunity, inherited resilience, and communal memory shapes future generations. People internalize lessons about contagion, timing, sanitation, and risk management. These adaptations, though learned through hardship, prepare societies to navigate future crises more effectively. In the end, disease is more than an interruption of life, it is a force of history. It shapes societies, redistributes power, and teaches survival through loss, observation, and adaptation. Epidemics reveal that survival depends not only on strength, but on knowledge, cooperation, and foresight. Ordinary people, lords and rulers alike, must navigate the consequences, often with incomplete information and limited tools. And yet, the ultimate reflection emerges. If invisible forces can alter the course of entire regions, claim millions of lives, and shift the balance of power in ways no army or king could predict, then perhaps history is not simply written by human decisions, but by the persistent, unseen influence of nature itself. Story 8. The Silent Builders' Cathedrals, Labor, and Devotion in the High Middle Ages. Imagine standing in a village at the edge of a forest in the 12th century, looking at the wooden chapel of your town, modest and humble. Now imagine a new vision, a massive stone structure rising over decades, soaring towers, intricate carvings, and stained glass windows that cast color across stone floors. This is the cathedral, a monumental project that will consume generations, demanding labor, skill, devotion, and patience from everyone involved. The decision to build a cathedral is not whimsical. Lords, bishops, and communities see these structures as symbols of religious devotion, political authority, and civic pride. Yet they are also practical undertakings, centers for worship, administration, and commerce. Planning begins with surveying land, assessing resources, and marshaling labor. Stone, timber, and metal must be sourced from sometimes hundreds of miles away. Transportation is slow, often dependent on oxen, carts, and waterways. Every material is precious, every error costly. Labor is organized meticulously. Masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and laborers form a hierarchical workforce. Skilled artisans are rare and highly valued. Apprentices are trained over decades. Work proceeds in seasonal cycles. In winter, planning, carving, and indoor tasks. In summer, transport, masonry, and construction. Daily life is structured around the rhythms of labor, reflecting both practical necessity and the broader spiritual purpose of the project. For ordinary villagers, participation is both opportunity and obligation. Serfs and peasants may provide labor as part of feudal dues. Some work for wages, others as a form of tribute. Food, lodging, and tools must be provided, and managing this logistics chain is itself a massive undertaking. The cathedral is more than a building. It is a regional enterprise that integrates the community, demands coordination, and transforms daily life. Skills are learned and transmitted orally and through apprenticeship. Master masons teach geometry, measurement, and structural techniques. Knowledge of stone quality, stress points, and tools is painstakingly accumulated. Even small mistakes can compromise stability, making experience invaluable. You observe, learn, and repeat, knowing that your labor contributes to a structure that will outlast your lifetime. Time itself is compressed and elongated simultaneously. Construction can span decades, sometimes over a century. Generations grow up, work, and pass away without seeing the completed vision. Laborers accept this not with impatience, but with a sense of duty, faith, and continuity. The cathedral becomes a symbol of perseverance, a monument to human endurance in the service of belief. Religious devotion intertwines with labor. Every action carving a column, laying stone, raising a roof beam is infused with spiritual significance. Tools become instruments of faith. Sweat and effort are forms of offering. Observing this, you realize that construction is not merely physical but deeply psychological, shaping community identity and individual purpose. Economic and logistical systems evolve around construction. Quarries, forests, and metalworks supply materials. Trade networks expand to support construction needs, connecting villages, towns, and even regions. Funds must be collected through tithe, donations, and feudal obligations. Money, food, and labor all flow toward the same project, creating an early example of complex, coordinated regional effort. Yet dangers are omnipresent. Work is physically demanding and often deadly. Falls from scaffolds, crushed hands, and injuries from tools or stone are common. Planning failures can collapse sections of the structure, destroying months or years of labor. Disease, weather, and political instability further threaten progress. Survival, skill, and foresight are constantly tested. For observers and participants alike, cathedrals embody contradiction. Monumental yet fragile, enduring yet dependent on human mortality. They teach patience, coordination, skill, and devotion simultaneously. Every stone laid carries centuries of accumulated knowledge. Every carving reflects training, artistry, and care. The labor is exhaustive, yet it is also meaningful, binding communities together in a shared vision. And still, the lingering question remains. If these massive structures demand generations of labor, resources, and skill, yet many who begin never see completion, what drives human beings to undertake such feats, and how does this devotion shape both individual lives and collective society? Construction of a cathedral is as much an exercise in management and organization as it is in craftsmanship. For every stone lifted, every beam placed, there is planning, coordination, and supervision. You come to understand that cathedrals are not only spiritual monuments but logistical marvels, requiring systems that resemble early project management. The master mason is central. Highly skilled and respected, he interprets the vision of the bishop or patron into practical construction plans. He must understand geometry, load distribution, and the properties of stone. Apprentices shadow him for years, learning not just techniques, but judgment, the subtle sense of how a structure will bear weight, weather, and time. Mistakes can cost lives, money, and progress. Every action is deliberate. Laborers are organized hierarchically. Skilled artisans carve intricate designs and structural elements. General laborers transport materials, mix mortar, or erect scaffolding. Seasonal rhythms dictate activity. Heavy work in summer, preparation and carving in winter. Coordination requires careful attention to timing. A delay in one task, stone cutting, roof assembly, or timber framing, can halt months of work. You learn that patience and foresight are as essential as strength. Supply chains are intricate. Stone must be quarried, shaped, and transported. Timber cut, seasoned, and delivered. Metals forged and distributed. Transport often involves carts, oxen, and river barges. Roads are rudimentary, and weather can halt movement for days or weeks. Even a well-planned project is vulnerable to disruptions. You realize that cathedrals are not just local efforts, they link villages, towns, and regions into a coordinated network of production, labor, and logistics. Economic organization is equally complex. Funding comes from tithes, donations, indulgences, and the labor of serfs. Payments in kind, grain, timber, or stone supplement wages. Resource allocation is continuous. Food for workers, tools for artisans, and payment for skilled masons must be balanced against scarcity. Mismanagement can halt progress, spark disputes, or cause failure. The project is an early example of large-scale economic coordination, reliant on social hierarchy and trust. Religious belief underpins every aspect of construction. Laborers perceive their work as devotional. The act of lifting a stone or carving a capital is imbued with spiritual significance. Mistakes are not only practical but moral. Poor craftsmanship may dishonor God. Rituals, blessings, and ceremonies mark milestones in construction, reinforcing the sacred purpose behind laborious tasks. You sense that the cathedral is both a building and a shared moral framework. Apprenticeship ensures continuity. Young masons learn by doing, observing, and imitating. Knowledge is transmitted orally and experientially. There are few written guides. Techniques like ribbed vaulting, flying buttresses, and pointed arches are complex innovations, yet are learned through mentorship. Each generation refines the methods of the previous, ensuring progress over decades. You understand that cathedrals are knowledge repositories as much as spiritual centers. Dangers remain ever present. Scaffolding collapses, stones fall, and heavy timbers crush. Disease and exhaustion claim workers. Political instability or funding shortages can stall construction indefinitely. Survival is intertwined with skill and vigilance. Life expectancy for laborers is lower than for the clergy or patrons, yet the effort is collectively meaningful. Every injury, every misstep is absorbed into the larger rhythm of the project. The social impact is profound. Communities rally around construction. Villagers, artisans, and nobles see their labor as part of a shared identity. Festivals, feasts, and market days align with milestones in building. Even those not directly involved are affected. Trade flourishes to supply the workforce, infrastructure improves, and skills are disseminated across regions. Cathedrals are both communal projects and cultural accelerants. And yet, as progress unfolds, a question emerges. If entire generations contribute to a structure they may never see finished, what motivates this extraordinary dedication? And how does the act of building shape the lives, values, and identity of those who labor in obscurity? After decades, sometimes a century of relentless work, a cathedral rises. The vision is finally tangible: soaring arches, intricate stained glass, sculpted portals, and echoing halls. Yet for many who labored, the culmination is witnessed only by a few. Generations of workers may have passed, leaving behind skill, sweat, and devotion embedded in stone. The building itself becomes a record of human endurance, organization, and belief. The completed cathedral reshapes society in profound ways. It becomes a center of worship, administration, commerce, and culture. Markets develop nearby, pilgrimage routes form. Festivals and feasts mark the rhythm of civic life. The cathedral's presence influences the identity of the town and surrounding villages. Its construction has trained generations of artisans, created networks of trade, and established social hierarchies that endure. Every element of society, from peasants to nobles, is touched by its existence. Architecturally, these structures push the boundaries of engineering. Innovations like ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, and pointed arches solve problems of weight distribution, allowing unprecedented height and light. Each solution reflects accumulated knowledge and experimentation. Techniques refined over decades are codified and disseminated, influencing other building projects across regions. Cathedrals are not isolated marvels, they are hubs of innovation and education, preserving technical expertise across generations. Economically, the cathedral's impact extends far beyond its walls. The demand for materials stone, timber, glass, iron stimulates local and regional economies. Quarries, forests, and workshops grow into specialized industries. Labor shortages or surpluses created during construction leave lasting marks on population distribution, wages, and labor expectations. The cathedral functions as both a spiritual and economic engine. Religiously, the cathedral embodies the power and authority of the church. Bishops use the space for ceremonies, governance, and consolidation of influence. Laypeople experience the structure as both sacred and awe-inspiring. Pilgrimages bring devotion, revenue, and cultural exchange. Symbolism in stained glass, sculpture, and architecture communicates moral, theological, and historical narratives to a largely illiterate population. For many, the cathedral is the intersection of faith, knowledge, and daily life. Socially, the laborer's influence endures invisibly. Their skills, practices, and social networks diffuse into the wider community. Apprentices trained on one cathedral carry techniques to the next project, spreading expertise and establishing professional norms. Villagers learn logistical organization, cooperative work, and project management. Even ordinary participants, those hauling stone or preparing meals, internalize lessons about persistence, coordination, and communal effort. The legacy of labor transcends the individual. Risk and sacrifice are remembered as part of the collective narrative. Accidents, injuries, and deaths are incorporated into local lore. Workers are memorialized indirectly through the endurance of their craft. Families pass down knowledge, pride, and identity linked to the project. The cathedral becomes a repository not only of stone and glass, but of human effort, memory, and community values. Culturally, cathedrals inspire art, music, and scholarship. Choirs fill the soaring halls with complex compositions. Manuscripts and libraries develop within monastic and episcopal institutions. Scholars and clerics study the architecture itself. Knowledge accumulates, both spiritual and practical, creating hubs of intellectual activity that extend influence beyond local communities. Yet even as grandeur dominates, the laborer's experience remains central. You realize that while nobles and clergy may commission, design, or bless the cathedral, the physical realization is the product of countless anonymous hands. Each stone laid is testimony to endurance, patience, and devotion. Generational continuity is embedded in the very structure. The building embodies human resilience, skill, and coordination across decades. And so, as you walk through the nave, marvel at the light filtering through stained glass, and touch the carved capitals, a thought lingers. If the greatest achievements of human culture depend on the quiet labor of those who will never receive recognition, then how do we measure influence, legacy, or meaning? And what does that reveal about the true authors of history? Cathedrals stand as silent witnesses to ambition, faith, and the remarkable capacity of ordinary people to shape extraordinary things. They are physical records of centuries-long collaboration, technical ingenuity, and spiritual aspiration. In their shadows, we understand that history is not only the story of kings and battles, but also of laborers, apprentices, and communities who, through persistence and skill, leave enduring marks on the world. Story 9. Monasteries and Knowledge: How Monks Preserved the Ancient World. Imagine stepping into a quiet stone monastery in the early medieval period, far from the noise of towns and the chaos of war. Outside, the world is tumultuous. Raids, famine, disease, and shifting political boundaries are constants, but inside, a different rhythm prevails. The slow, deliberate work of copying texts, studying scripture, and observing the passage of time. Monks, often anonymous and unheralded, act as the guardians of knowledge in a world where literacy is rare and books are precious. Life in a monastery is structured by discipline, devotion, and labor. Days begin before sunrise with prayer, followed by communal reading, study, and manual work. Some monks tend gardens, livestock, or workshops. Others engage in copying manuscripts, illuminating texts, or recording historical events. Every task, whether scrubbing floors, shaping quills, or mixing ink, is performed with a combination of humility and purpose. In a sense, daily life itself is a meditation on continuity, preservation, and survival. The materials are painstakingly prepared. Parchment is scraped from animal skins, ink is made from soot, iron gall, and natural dyes. Quills must be trimmed, ruled lines drawn, and pages carefully aligned. The work is slow. A single manuscript can take months or years to complete. Mistakes are costly, as correction is laborious, and every word carries moral and intellectual weight. Monks understand that their work preserves not only religious texts, but the cultural and scientific heritage of earlier civilizations. Libraries within monasteries become sanctuaries. Ancient Roman, Greek, and early Christian works are collected, copied, and cataloged. Mathematical treatises, medical texts, philosophical dialogues, and legal documents are painstakingly reproduced. Without these efforts, much of classical knowledge might have vanished. The preservation of texts is a quiet act of rebellion against forgetfulness, chaos, and destruction. Even as kingdoms rise and fall, these manuscripts endure. Discipline governs all aspects of life. Monks follow strict schedules. Prayer, study, and work are precisely timed. Silence is often enforced during certain periods, not as punishment but as a means to focus the mind. Contemplation is considered as valuable as labor. Knowledge is treated as sacred. The act of writing is both devotional and practical. Through repetition, observation, and careful attention, skills in reading, writing, and critical thinking are cultivated. Economic activity supports this work. Monasteries farm their land, produce food, and sometimes craft goods for trade. Revenue is often reinvested into manuscripts, building projects, or charitable endeavors. While cloisters appear insulated, they are part of broader economic networks, connecting distant communities through trade in books, relics, and supplies. Every resource is carefully managed to sustain intellectual and spiritual pursuits. Monks also play a critical role in education. They teach local children, train novices, and provide instruction in Latin, arithmetic, and religious doctrine. Knowledge is transmitted slowly, orally, and through demonstration. The monastery is a hub of literacy and learning in a largely illiterate society, offering continuity amid the disruption of the Dark Ages. Political and social influence is subtle but significant. Kings, nobles, and bishops often seek counsel from learned monks. Diplomatic correspondence, legal documents, and treaties are drafted in monasteries. Monks serve as scribes, advisors, and intermediaries, preserving not only books but also political memory. The continuity they provide stabilizes societies otherwise buffeted by conflict and uncertainty. Yet the work is not glamorous. Repetitive, meticulous, and physically demanding, manuscript copying is often invisible to outsiders. Success is measured not by wealth or status, but by accuracy, devotion, and endurance. Monks labor in silence, yet their influence reverberates across centuries, shaping scholarship, culture, and collective memory long after the cloistered walls are forgotten. The unending question emerges. If the preservation of knowledge depends on the discipline, patience, and labor of a few isolated individuals, how much of what we understand as history or civilization exists solely because of their quiet dedication, and how fragile is that legacy in the face of chaos, ignorance, and time? Inside the monastery, the act of copying a manuscript is both sacred duty and intellectual survival. Each monk, seated at a simple desk or lectern, wields a quill with painstaking precision. Parchment is stretched and smoothed, ink mixed carefully, letters formed deliberately, one at a time. Mistakes are rare because corrections require scraping the surface of the page, a labor-intensive process that could ruin months of work. The skill involved is immense, combining artistry, concentration, and dexterity, and yet it is often invisible to the outside world. The manuscripts themselves are treasures. Religious texts dominate, but the preservation of secular knowledge is equally vital. Ancient works by Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, and Roman legal codes are painstakingly copied, often with commentary and annotations. Some monasteries specialize in particular areas. One may preserve medical texts, another arithmetic and geometry, yet another histories of kingdoms long fallen. Through these efforts, fragments of the classical world survive periods of instability, conquest, and neglect. Illumination and decoration are integral. Initials are embellished with intricate designs. Margins sometimes feature small illustrations or symbols that guide the reader. Colors are derived from minerals, plants, and insects. A single red pigment might come from crushed cochineal insects, blue from lapis lazuli imported across continents. Every color, every brushstroke, is a combination of craftsmanship, knowledge, and devotion. Monks often spend years perfecting these skills, and the manuscripts themselves become works of art as well as repositories of knowledge. Cataloging is another critical function. As libraries grow, monks develop rudimentary systems for organizing texts by subject, author, or importance. Shelves, chests, and storage cabinets are carefully labeled. Knowledge of which texts exist and where they are located becomes essential to scholarship, diplomacy, and governance. Without this attention to order, centuries of labor could be lost to misplacement or neglect. Monasteries also preserve oral knowledge. Liturgical chants, local histories, genealogies, and practical instructions are taught by word of mouth. Novices memorize prayers, readings, and techniques for copying, ensuring continuity when manuscripts themselves are unavailable or damaged. Oral tradition is intertwined with written preservation, creating redundancy that safeguards information against fire, decay, or theft. Labor is cyclical and seasonal. Farming, construction, and maintenance occupy certain periods, while winter or slow agricultural seasons allow greater focus on copying and study. Even mundane tasks, baking bread, tending gardens, repairing tools, support the larger intellectual mission. Monks understand that survival of the community and survival of knowledge are inseparable. Without food, water, and shelter, no manuscripts can be produced or preserved. Political and social events intersect with monastic life in subtle ways. A war, raid, or plague may drive monks to relocate manuscripts, hide treasures, or rewrite copies hastily. Correspondence with kings and nobles often requires precision and discretion, as a single miswritten phrase could provoke conflict or misunderstandings. Monks are not only preservers of knowledge, they are also early bureaucrats, diplomats, and historians, documenting events in real time. Economic systems support the work. Monasteries rely on donations, tithes, and production from their lands. Some produce wine, cheese, or textiles for trade, using the proceeds to fund manuscript copying. Others host travelers, pilgrims, or scholars, further integrating the monastery into regional networks. The survival of intellectual work is closely linked to these material foundations, reminding us that knowledge is never divorced from the practical realities of daily life. Even as centuries pass, the impact of these efforts becomes clear. Texts copied in monasteries serve as sources for universities centuries later. Classical knowledge preserved in scriptoria underpins Renaissance thought. Medical texts inform treatment long after the original author is forgotten. The quiet, repetitive labor of a few isolated individuals lays the foundation for much of Western intellectual history. And yet, a persistent question remains. If the fate of knowledge, and by extension culture, science, and history, rests on the meticulous work of a few dedicated individuals in cloisters, how much of what we know today might have been lost? How fragile is human understanding in the face of time, chaos, and the simple vulnerability of ink and parchment? As decades and centuries pass, the manuscripts and knowledge preserved in monasteries begin to ripple outward, shaping societies far beyond the cloistered walls. The work of copying, cataloging, and illuminating texts ensures that ideas survive political upheaval, war, and plague. What might have been lost to chaos becomes the foundation of future learning, education, and cultural memory. Monasteries become centers of intellectual continuity. Libraries grow, collections expand, and networks of knowledge form between institutions. Monks exchange copies, correspondence, and observations, linking distant regions into a web of learning. Innovations in script, notation, and illumination spread along these networks, creating a shared language of scholarship. In effect, monasteries become both repositories and conduits, preserving the past while transmitting it to the future. Education extends beyond the cloister. Some monasteries establish schools for local children or train novices to become future scribes and scholars. Literacy, though rare in the broader population, becomes concentrated among clergy and administrators, allowing the administrative machinery of kingdoms and cities to function. Diplomatic correspondence, legal codification, and governance rely on the careful labor of these literate individuals. Knowledge preserved within monasteries thus directly shapes the political and social fabric of medieval Europe. Religious life intertwines with intellectual preservation. Monks see their labor not only as practical but spiritual. To copy a text is to honor God, to maintain truth, and to participate in the divine plan. Their devotion ensures meticulous accuracy, with attention to detail that safeguards meaning across generations. The act of preservation itself becomes a form of worship, linking faith to the survival of culture. The influence of these efforts becomes most evident during periods of crisis. During wars, plagues, and invasions, monasteries often serve as safe havens for texts and scholars. When towns are sacked or libraries burned, copies hidden in scriptoria survive. Through this resilience, monasteries act as time capsules, ensuring that the intellectual achievements of antiquity Greek philosophy, Roman law, medical knowledge, and early science reach later generations. Without their work, the Renaissance, universities, and the spread of literacy would have been profoundly limited. Economic and social networks also expand as a result. Manuscripts are traded, commissioned, and gifted. Scribes travel between monasteries, sharing techniques and texts. Patrons, including kings, nobles, and wealthy merchants, fund the copying and distribution of books. In this way, monastic labor creates a web of cultural and economic exchange, intertwining intellectual survival with material and social realities. The labor is cumulative. A single monk's work may seem minor, perhaps one illuminated page, one copied text, but when combined with decades of labor across generations, the impact is immense. Knowledge that would have vanished is instead transmitted, refined, and built upon. The monastery becomes a hub of human continuity, ensuring that civilization itself is not entirely at the mercy of randomness, conquest, or neglect. Even the mundane aspects of monastic life, cleaning, farming, tending livestock, are crucial. Without a sustainable, well-organized community, intellectual work could not continue. The monastery demonstrates that practical labor and intellectual preservation are inseparable. Food, shelter, and social order are as essential as quills, ink, and parchment. Survival enables scholarship, just as scholarship requires survival. The ultimate reflection emerges as you walk through a monastery's library or examine a centuries-old manuscript. The continuity of civilization rests on the quiet, meticulous labor of countless individuals who remain largely unknown. Their daily dedication, copying, cataloging, observing, and teaching ensures that the wisdom of the past informs the present and the future. History is often told through kings, wars, and politics, but it is preserved by those who labor in silence, whose work allows knowledge to transcend time and disaster. And so, the lingering question remains: if the survival of culture, science, and civilization depends on the patient, repetitive work of a few devoted individuals, then how much of human understanding and our sense of continuity is the product of unseen labor, and how many more ideas were lost to history because they lacked such quiet guardians? Story 10. Bridges, roads, and rivers, the infrastructure that connected medieval Europe. Picture the medieval landscape: dense forests, marshes, and hills stretching for miles, dotted with villages and towns that are isolated from one another. Movement is slow, risky, and often limited to those who travel for trade, pilgrimage, or warfare. Yet over time, the construction of bridges, roads, and navigable rivers begins to change everything. This infrastructure transforms the way people interact, how goods move, and how ideas spread, even if the labor and ingenuity behind it often go unnoticed. Roads are the lifeblood of connection. Early medieval paths are narrow, unpaved, and often muddy. Travel is hazardous. Bandits, wild animals, and poor weather constantly threaten life and livelihood. The construction and maintenance of even short stretches of road requires planning, labor, and coordination. Villages rely on local labor to clear forests, drain marshes, and lay basic gravel or stones. Towns invest resources to ensure that markets and religious centers remain accessible. Every mile built reduces isolation and increases opportunity. Bridges, in particular, are monumental achievements. Spanning rivers and streams requires knowledge of stone, wood, and basic engineering principles. Some structures are simple wooden beams, but others, like the stone bridges of Avignon or Ravenna, demonstrate both durability and ingenuity. Foundations must be laid in shifting currents, arches constructed to distribute weight, materials transported from quarries often far away. A bridge is not just a crossing. It is a symbol of human problem-solving, coordination, and persistence. Rivers themselves are both obstacles and highways. Navigable rivers allow bulk goods to move far faster than by road. Communities settle along riverbanks, establishing ports, wharves, and warehouses. Trade flourishes, towns grow, and information travels faster than before. Control of waterways becomes strategically important for both commerce and defense. Seasonal changes, however, can disrupt navigation. Floods, droughts, and ice alter routes, demanding constant adaptation. Labor for infrastructure is both voluntary and coerced. Nobles and local lords may levy labor taxes or require peasants to contribute days of work to road or bridge projects. Skilled artisans, masons, carpenters, and engineers are compensated with wages, land, or privileges. Ordinary laborers haul stones, shape timber, and maintain structures. Construction is physically demanding, often dangerous, yet essential for survival and prosperity. Funding is another challenge. Bridges and roads require ongoing maintenance. Stones erode, wooden supports rot, and floods wash away sections. Communities organize tolls, labor contributions, or feudal obligations to sustain infrastructure. Even in times of scarcity, leaders understand that connectivity ensures trade, communication, and security. Without investment, isolation increases vulnerability to famine, raids, and disease. The economic impact is profound. Roads and bridges enable regional markets to grow, allowing farmers to sell surplus crops beyond their villages. Artisans can reach new customers, merchants expand trade networks. Towns connected by infrastructure flourish, while those cut off remain stagnant. Infrastructure, though costly and labor-intensive, is the engine of regional economic growth and social interaction. Political consequences are equally significant. Control over roads, bridges, and river crossings grants strategic advantage. Lords who manage infrastructure can collect tolls, enforce authority, and project influence. Military campaigns depend on reliable roads and bridges. Armies cannot move efficiently without them. Infrastructure shapes political power as much as geography, influencing where battles are fought and where settlements thrive. Safety and survival are intertwined with engineering. Poorly constructed roads lead to accidents. Fragile bridges collapse under heavy loads. Knowledge of materials, water behavior, and seasonal cycles is essential. Lessons accumulate over generations, creating a body of practical engineering wisdom that remains largely undocumented, preserved in craft traditions and oral instruction. And yet, even as progress unfolds, a persistent question emerges. If the ability to connect communities depends on the labor, skill, and foresight of ordinary people, those who haul stone, clear forests, and maintain paths, then how much of the growth of medieval society rests on unseen efforts? And how differently would history have unfolded without these silent builders of connection? Building a road or a bridge is only the beginning. The real challenge lies in maintenance. Medieval infrastructure is vulnerable to floods, frost, landslides, and wear from traffic. Villages organize labor cycles to repair pathways, reinforce bridges, and clear waterways. This continuous attention reflects an understanding that connectivity is not static, it is fragile, requiring vigilance, coordination, and community investment. Materials dictate durability and innovation. Stones are chosen for density and resistance to erosion. Timber is selected for strength and treated for longevity. Techniques evolve over time. Builders experiment with arch designs, abutment placement, and drainage channels to resist seasonal flooding. Over decades, incremental innovations produce structures that last centuries. though the techniques are preserved mostly through apprenticeship rather than written manuals. Knowledge is both embodied and communal, carried forward by those who have worked with their hands. Bridges, in particular, demand careful planning. The weight of carts, livestock, and foot traffic must be distributed evenly. Arches are engineered to transfer loads to piers, piers anchored into riverbeds. Builders observe the flow of water, adjusting designs for seasonal variations. Mistakes can be catastrophic. A collapsed bridge not only destroys months of work, but isolates entire communities, disrupting trade and communication. Every successful span is a triumph of observation, labor, and collective effort. Roads themselves evolve gradually. Initial dirt paths are widened, raised, and drained. Cobblestones are laid in key trade corridors. Strategic waypoints, inns, wells, and ferries support travelers, merchants, and pilgrims. Seasonal work is critical. Roads must be repaired after winter frost, summer floods, or heavy use during harvests. Communities collaborate to maintain these lifelines, understanding that their survival and prosperity depend on uninterrupted passage. Rivers are harnessed and managed as natural highways. Dams, weirs, and locks regulate water flow for navigation, milling, and irrigation. Timber rafts or barges transport grain, timber, and goods far faster than overland routes. Pilots develop intimate knowledge of currents, sandbanks, and seasonal hazards. Expertise is often concentrated in families or guilds, transmitted through apprenticeship, creating a network of specialists who ensure that commerce and travel remain feasible even under challenging conditions. Economic effects are transformative. Markets expand as goods move more reliably, creating interdependencies between regions. Farmers sell surplus to distant towns. Craftsmen supply urban centers, and trade in salt, textiles, and metals grows. Villages connected by reliable infrastructure accumulate wealth, attract settlers, and develop into towns. Isolation, in contrast, limits opportunity and stifles innovation. Roads and bridges, often unnoticed in daily life, become invisible engines of regional development. Political power is reinforced through infrastructure control. Lords and kings levy tolls, enforce regulations, and monitor movement. Strategic bridges become points of defense, taxation, and influence. Armies rely on reliable roads and crossings for campaigns, as delays or failures can determine victory or defeat. Infrastructure is both practical and political, a tangible extension of authority that intersects with economics, security, and diplomacy. Infrastructure also enables the spread of ideas, culture, and religion. Pilgrims travel with relative safety. Clerics move between towns. Merchants and scholars exchange knowledge. Connectivity facilitates not only commerce but intellectual and cultural exchange. Cities and monasteries, linked by roads and rivers, form the backbone of communication in a pre-modern world. The infrastructure silently shapes how society develops, long before formal postal systems or trade organizations emerge. Even survival itself is tied to connectivity. During famine, flood, or epidemic, roads and bridges allow relief supplies to reach affected communities. Without infrastructure, isolated villages are vulnerable to starvation or disease. Observation, planning, and coordination among laborers and communities save lives, often without fanfare or recognition. Ordinary work repairing a bridge, maintaining a path, or clearing a river channel becomes a lifeline. And yet, as you consider the network of roads, bridges, and rivers, the same question recurs. If the growth, trade, and resilience of medieval Europe depend on these silent networks and the laborers who maintain them, then how many societies and civilizations might have faltered simply because someone failed to notice that survival is built on the quiet work of connection? By the late Middle Ages, Europe is crisscrossed with a complex web of roads, bridges, and navigable rivers. What began as humble paths through forests and meadows has become a network connecting villages, towns, cities, and ports. These silent frameworks shape society in ways both immediate and lasting, often unnoticed by the travelers who rely upon them daily. Bridges stand as monuments to human ingenuity and collaboration. Stone spans, some surviving into modern times, bear witness to decades of planning, labor, and trial-and-error construction. Every arch and pier carries the imprint of artisans, masons, and laborers whose names are lost to history. These structures are more than functional, they are symbols of civic pride, engineering skill, and the coordination necessary to overcome natural obstacles. Roads are arteries of commerce and culture. Markets flourish along well-traveled routes, towns grow in proportion to accessibility, and fairs emerge at crossroads. Pilgrims, merchants, and soldiers rely on these pathways, making trade, religion, and governance possible across vast distances. Even minor improvements draining marshy stretches, reinforcing paths with stones, or building rudimentary causeways accelerate economic growth and cultural exchange. Each improvement demonstrates the long-term impact of persistent, often unglorified labor. Rivers, managed through locks, weirs, and ports, become the highways of bulk goods. Grain, timber, salt, and metal move far more efficiently than overland routes allow. Pilots and barge crews, trained in river currents and seasonal hazards, ensure that commerce and communication flow smoothly. River infrastructure not only supports the economy but shapes settlement patterns, with towns clustering along navigable stretches. Control of these waterways often determines the prosperity or vulnerability of entire regions. The labor invested in infrastructure also influences social hierarchy. Skilled masons, carpenters, and engineers gain prestige. Ordinary laborers contribute indispensable effort. Villagers involved in road or bridge maintenance acquire knowledge, routines, and practices that benefit the community long after the original project ends. Infrastructure becomes a medium through which human coordination, knowledge transmission, and survival converge. The work of ordinary people is embedded in the very fabric of society, though often invisible in historical records. Economic networks are transformed. Reliable connections reduce the cost of trade, expand markets, and allow specialization. Farmers produce surplus knowing they can reach distant markets. Craftsmen reach urban customers. Merchants operate along predictable routes. Towns connected to main roads or river networks prosper, while isolated settlements remain vulnerable to famine, raids, or stagnation. Infrastructure, once purely practical, emerges as a determinant of wealth, opportunity, and social mobility. Political power is reinforced and contested through these networks. Bridges are toll points. Roads facilitate military campaigns. Rivers serve as both trade routes and defensive barriers. Lords who maintain infrastructure assert authority. Those who neglect it risk rebellion, economic decline, or military failure. Planning, labor, and oversight of these silent structures become instruments of governance, shaping societies long before formal state institutions exist. Cultural and intellectual exchange is accelerated. Monks, scholars, and clerics travel along roads and rivers, carrying books, ideas, and skills. Pilgrimages bring people from distant regions into contact, fostering the spread of religious practice, artistic motifs, and technical knowledge. Infrastructure is therefore not just physical but social and intellectual. It underpins the movement of knowledge as much as goods. Even survival is intimately linked to these networks. During famine, plague, or natural disaster, roads and bridges allow relief to reach isolated communities. Communication of warnings, requests for aid, and coordination of resources depend on the reliability of these connections. The lives of ordinary people, often overlooked in grand historical narratives, are safeguarded by these silent lifelines. Ultimately, bridges, roads, and rivers shape medieval Europe in profound and enduring ways. They link communities, support commerce, enable governance, and foster cultural and intellectual exchange. Yet the labor that creates and maintains them, the hauling of stone, the shaping of timber, the careful management of rivers, is largely invisible, performed by ordinary people whose names rarely appear in chronicles. Their work underpins society, demonstrating that historical progress often depends on the quiet persistence of the unseen majority. And so, as you traverse a centuries-old stone bridge or follow the path of a medieval road, the reflection emerges. If human connection, survival, and progress rely on labor so easily overlooked, then the true architects of history may not be kings, generals, or scholars, but the countless ordinary hands that built and maintained the networks allowing civilization to endure.